They fired the one man holding the whole thing together, not with anger, not with a fight. They did it on a Tuesday morning with a cardboard box, a security escort, and an HR form printed on company letterhead. 32-year-old Ethan Brooks carried that box out through the same bay doors he'd walked through 10,000 times before. Past the machines he'd fixed, past the systems he'd built from nothing, past engineers who stared at their shoes. He stopped once, looked back, said 6 words no one took seriously. 6 hours later, they wished they had. Drop a comment with your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, and stay with me all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The fluorescent lights in Bay 7 hummed the way they always did. That low, slightly uneven buzz that sounded like a fly trapped inside a jar. Most people tuned it out within their first week. Ethan Brooks had been hearing it for 9 years, and he still noticed it every single morning. It was one of the things about him that his coworkers never quite understood. He noticed everything. The half-degree temperature variation near the east compressor that showed up every time the overnight crew ran a full coolant flush. The specific metallic tick inside the articulated frame assembly that meant the mounting bolts were approaching micro-fatigue. The way the hydraulic lines in the lower chassis whispered, not made any sound a human could reasonably describe as a whisper, but Ethan called it that. And somehow it made sense to the 3 guys who'd worked alongside him long enough to know what he meant. He was crouching next to Panel 7C when Marcus arrived at 6:47, 15 minutes before shift start, coffee in hand, cap pulled low against the early morning facility cold. "You sleep here?" Marcus asked, not breaking stride. "Found something." Ethan didn't look up. His flashlight was angled into the lower cavity of the housing unit, his face 3 inches from a cluster of connectors that most people wouldn't have been able to identify with a manual in front of them. Marcus stopped. He knew that tone. Not alarm exactly. Ethan rarely did alarm. It was more like a particular kind of stillness in his voice that meant he'd been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at a conclusion he didn't love. "The TVC coupling?" Marcus asked. "Thermal expansion seal on the secondary interface bracket." Ethan pulled back and sat on his heels, turning the flashlight over in his hand. Someone replaced it with a B-series component during last week's scheduled swap. Should have been C-series, rated for the operating temperature range we're running in this configuration. Marcus squinted. "That's not going to cause a problem during standard cycle, is it?" "No." Ethan stood, his knees cracking in a way that he barely noticed anymore. "Not during standard cycle." He clicked the flashlight off and tucked it into his belt. "But they're running extended pressure simulation in 3 days. Sustained load, elevated temperatures, 6-hour window." He looked at the panel. "That seal wasn't designed for 6 hours at those levels." Marcus lowered his coffee. "You sure?" "I can pull the spec sheet if you want me to pull the spec sheet." "I believe you, man. I just mean, have you flagged it?" Ethan picked up his clipboard from the floor and checked something on it. "Put it in the maintenance log last night. Emailed Kowalski at 6 this morning." He paused. "I'll mention it to him in person when he comes in." That should have been the end of it. A component flagged, a fix scheduled, a problem avoided before it became a problem. That was how it was supposed to work. But this particular Tuesday was not like most Tuesdays. Olivia Sterling arrived at Meridian Aerospace Solutions at 8:15 in a black SUV she hadn't driven herself, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly salary, and carrying the kind of controlled energy expression that people develop when they've spent their entire adult lives being watched and assessed. She was 30 years old. She had acquired Meridian 6 weeks ago as part of a broader industrial portfolio expansion. The company was the 4th acquisition she'd completed in 18 months, and from the outside, it looked like everything was moving exactly according to plan. The truth, as truths tend to be, was more complicated. Meridian's flagship project, a next-generation autonomous aerospace assembly contract with a federal agency that would not be named in any press release, but whose initials meant a great deal in certain rooms in Washington, was 14 months into a 22-month development cycle. The contract was worth $240 million. It was, at this particular moment in Meridian's corporate history, the only thing keeping the company solvent. Olivia knew this. What she didn't know, what she didn't yet have the institutional history to know, was how many of the systems keeping that project alive ran through one person's head. She walked through the lobby and shook 4 hands before she reached the elevator. Richard Hale was waiting for her on the 3rd floor. Richard was 53, gray at the temples, and wore the kind of confident, practiced smile that takes decades to construct. He'd been with Meridian for 16 years. He was VP of Engineering Operations. He knew where everybody was buried, figuratively speaking, because in most cases he was the one who'd done the burying. "Good morning, Miss Sterling." He extended his hand. "Richard?" She took it briefly. "Walk me through the morning. I've got the board call at 11. "Of course." He fell into step beside her. "I actually wanted to raise something before we get into operational details. It's a personnel matter I've been managing for some time, and I think this morning presents the right window to resolve it cleanly." Olivia listened. Richard was good at this, presenting information in a particular sequence and with a particular texture so that by the time you reached the conclusion, it felt like you'd arrived there yourself. He told her about Ethan Brooks in careful, measured strokes. Maintenance technician, 9 years with the company, good with his hands, solid institutional knowledge. And here Richard's voice carried just the right note of reluctant candor, as if he hated having to say this. There had been ongoing issues with documentation compliance, a pattern of refusing to work within established reporting structures. An incident the previous spring involving unsanctioned modifications to a secondary assembly that had required 2 days of engineering review to clear. "He's not a bad person," Richard said. He operates outside the framework. And right now, with the schedule we're on and the oversight environment we're navigating, I can't afford someone who does things his own way and expects everyone to just trust him." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "What's his role in the current project?" "Maintenance and physical systems support. His work gets checked and verified by the engineering team before anything moves forward. The institutional knowledge concern is overstated. It lives in documentation, not in one person." This was, in almost every meaningful respect, a lie. But it was a lie built on just enough structural truth that it would take someone with deep technical knowledge and time to dismantle it, and Olivia had neither on this particular morning. "Is there a performance record?" "I have a full file. It's not pretty." Richard set a manila folder on the conference table between them. She opened it, read through it quickly, frowned at 2 pages, closed it. She didn't know the file had been edited. She didn't know that 3 commendations had been removed. She didn't know that the incident involving unsanctioned modifications was actually a documented case where Ethan had corrected a structural error that would have failed a safety inspection, and that the 2 days of engineering review had ultimately confirmed he was right. She didn't know any of that. "Process it through HR," she said. "Today." Richard nodded and said, "I'll make sure it's handled with dignity." The word dignity sat in the air for a moment after he said it. Ethan was back in Bay 7 at 10:20 when Denise from HR appeared at the entrance. She was 29 years old and had been at Meridian for 14 months, and she had never done a termination before today. She was holding a clipboard and trying very hard to keep her face neutral. He saw her from across the bay and knew, not because he was psychic, because he was observant, and because he had watched enough things happen at this company over 9 years to recognize the particular walk that HR did when they were coming to deliver news they didn't want to deliver. He set his tools down slowly. "Mr. Brooks." She crossed the bay floor, heels clicking on the painted concrete. "I need to speak with you privately." "Okay." They went to the small glass-walled meeting room adjacent to the bay. She closed the door. Read from the clipboard. "Termination effective immediately. Restructuring and role elimination. Severance package in the attached document." She was careful and professional, and her voice only wavered once, briefly, near the end. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for several seconds. "Is this Hale's call or Sterling's?" he asked. Denise blinked. "The decision was made by senior leadership." "Right." He nodded slowly. "Okay." He looked out through the glass at Bay 7, at the equipment he'd nursed through 3 facility moves and 2 ownership changes, at the toolboxes with his labels on the drawers. "I'll need 20 minutes to get my things." "Of course, there'll be a security escort for the exit process. Company policy." "Yeah, I know." He got his things in 15 minutes, not 20. A cardboard box. Framed photo of his daughter, Lily, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, her mother's eyes. A coffee mug. 3 technical manuals he'd annotated so extensively they were more his writing than the original publishers. Marcus was waiting near the bay doors. He'd heard. Word moves fast in a building this size. Ethan, it's fine. It's not fine. It's completely... It is what it is. Ethan shifted the box to one arm and shook Marcus's hand with the other. You know where the B-Series seal issue is documented. Make sure Kowalski actually reads it before Thursday. Marcus's jaw tightened. I will. I promise. The security guard, young, uncomfortable, clearly wishing he was doing anything else today, held the door. Ethan walked out into the morning light. He stopped once, turned back and looked through the glass doors at the facility he'd spent a third of his life in. Then he looked directly at the security guard, who couldn't have known that what he was about to hear mattered. Tell whoever's running Bay 7 on Thursday, Ethan said, his voice completely even, that if they run the extended pressure simulation before replacing that thermal seal, they're going to have a very bad afternoon. The guard nodded with the polite blankness of someone who was not going to pass that message along. Ethan turned and walked to his car. The drive to Lily's school took 22 minutes. Ethan sat in the parking lot for a while after he arrived, engine off, looking at the cardboard box on the passenger seat. He didn't cry. That wasn't a pride thing. He'd cried plenty in his life. He'd cried for 3 weeks straight after his wife, Claire, died 5 years ago from an aggressive brain tumor that had moved faster than any of them were prepared for. He'd cried at Lily's first birthday without her mother, and at her first day of school, and at a random Tuesday evening in April, about 18 months ago, when Lily had said something offhand about how he made pancakes the same way Mama used to, and it had just hit him all at once. He didn't cry now because he didn't feel sad. He felt something more like a cold, dense recognition, the sense of watching something confirm itself. He had known, in the way that careful people often know things before they happen, that this was coming. He'd felt it in the shift in how Richard talked to him over the past year, the way certain meetings got canceled after he sent emails raising technical concerns, the way his name stopped appearing in project documentation he knew he'd contributed to. He'd stayed anyway, because the work mattered, and because the people in that building depended on the systems he maintained, and because he had a daughter to support and a mortgage, and the kind of practical stubbornness that keeps people at difficult jobs longer than they should stay. He went inside the school, signed Lily out early, office staff gave him a look, and he just said family matter and smiled, and drove them to the diner 3 blocks from their house where they always went for what Lily called special occasion pancakes. Lily, 7 years old and already possessed of a sharp perceptive intelligence that her teachers called precocious, and that Ethan privately thought was closer to her mother's than she'd ever know, studied his face across the table. You lost your job, didn't you? She said. Not a question. Ethan looked up from his menu. What makes you say that? Because it's Tuesday and we're getting pancakes. She tilted her head. Pancakes are for when things are either really good or really bad. He set the menu down. You're 7. I'm almost 8. She picked up the crayon the diner always left on the table and started coloring the kid's activity sheet. Are we going to be okay? It was such a clean, direct question. No drama in it, just information gathering. She had always been like that. Yes, he said. We're going to be okay. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her coloring. Dad? Yeah. Do you want to tell me what happened? He looked at her for a long moment. 7 years old, gap-toothed, her mother's eyes. A lady who owns the company made a decision based on wrong information, he said, and the person who gave her the wrong information did it on purpose. Lily processed this with a small frown. That's not fair. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. Are you going to fix it? He leaned back in his chair. Through the diner window, he could see the street. Ordinary mid-morning Tuesday, people walking dogs, a delivery truck double parked, the city doing its thing. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Lily returned to her coloring. I think you will, she said, in the uncomplicated tone of someone stating a fact that has already been established. You always fix things. The waitress came. Ethan ordered coffee in the short stack. Outside, the city hummed along. And in Base 7, 17 miles away, a B-series thermal expansion seal that should have been replaced sat quietly in a housing unit that would, in approximately 62 hours, be subjected to sustained pressure and elevated temperatures for 6 consecutive hours. What Richard Hale had built over 16 years was not precisely a fraud. It was more like an architecture of omission, a carefully maintained structure in which certain truths were present but positioned where they were unlikely to be found. He had not invented the technologies that had made Meridian competitive. He had not solved the integration problems that had kept the flagship project alive through 3 near-fatal setbacks. He had not developed the diagnostic methodology that the engineering team now used as standard protocol, even though they'd absorbed it so completely that most of them couldn't have told you where it came from. He had, however, made sure that his name appeared on the documentation of all those things. It had started small. 11 years ago, Ethan, then 21, fresh-faced, 2 years out of a trade program, with the kind of intuitive technical intelligence that formal education sometimes refines but occasionally can't contain, had submitted a written proposal for a revised thermal management approach on what was then Meridian's major military contract. The proposal was good. It was, in fact, better than good. Richard had been the receiving manager. He had sat with it for 3 days, done enough modification to obscure the origin, and submitted it upward under his own name. The proposal had been adopted. Richard had received a commendation. Ethan had received nothing, because officially Ethan's proposal hadn't existed. After that, the pattern was easy to maintain. Ethan operated in a world of physical systems and technical problems. Base 7, the shop floor, the machinery. Richard operated in a world of documentation, reports, and executive meetings. The two worlds touched each other at specific points, and Richard had spent years making sure he was the one controlling those touch points. He had kept Ethan's compensation modest. He had kept his title generic. He had filed paperwork that kept him in a category where his contributions were classified as support functions rather than engineering development. When other managers had tried to promote Ethan or move him into a more senior role, Richard had always managed to introduce friction. A performance concern here, a documentation issue there, nothing overt enough to be challenged, but persistent enough to close doors. He had done all of this not with cruelty exactly, but with the cold, pragmatic calculation of someone protecting something valuable. Ethan Brooks was valuable. Richard had simply decided that the value should belong to Richard. This morning, walking back to his office after confirming with HR that the termination had been processed, Richard allowed himself a moment of something he would not have called satisfaction, because that would have required acknowledging what he'd done. He called it resolution. A loose end, tidied. He was good at believing his own framing. What he was not good at was accounting for the physical world, the actual machinery and metal and engineering reality that Ethan had spent 9 years inhabiting. Richard understood systems on paper. He did not understand them the way Ethan did, because that kind of understanding cannot be documented or transferred or claimed as your own. It lives in a person. It goes where they go. He poured himself coffee in his office and began preparing for the 11 o'clock board call with Olivia Sterling. In Base 7, 2 floors below, the B-Series seal sat in its housing. 61 hours and 43 minutes until the simulation run. Lead engineer Dennis Kowalski had been at Meridian for 6 years and considered himself a thorough professional. He believed in proper documentation, clear communication, and the scientific method. He also believed, with a conviction born from watching one too many maintenance guys develop hero complexes, that the engineering team was the team that made decisions, and that input from support functions should be received and evaluated through proper channels, not treated as gospel because of the personal confidence with which it was delivered. He had seen Ethan Brooks's email at 8:50 that morning. He had flagged it for follow-up and moved on to his 9 o'clock meeting. By the time the 9 o'clock meeting ran long and became a 10:30 meeting, and by the time he'd come out of that to find 3 new emails from Olivia Sterling's office about the board call preparation, Ethan Brooks's email about a thermal expansion seal in a secondary interface bracket had drifted to page 2 of his inbox. He didn't know, yet, that Ethan had been terminated. That information arrived at 11:40 via the HR announcement, which he read with a slight frown and then filed away as not directly relevant to his immediate workload. He was, to be clear, a thorough professional. He wasn't negligent. He had a lot going on. But thoroughness has a failure mode, and its name is triage. When you're managing a complex project with multiple parallel threads and a regulatory review in 3 weeks, and an owner who is actively getting up to speed on your technology, things fall through the cracks. That's not incompetence, that's the gap between how systems are supposed to work and how they actually work when real humans are operating them under real pressure. The email about the thermal seal fell through that gap. Marcus tried. He flagged it to Kowalski in the hallway at 1 in the afternoon, said Ethan had mentioned something important about Bay 7 before he left. Kowalski had nodded and said he'd look into it, and then gotten pulled into a call with the procurement team that lasted 90 minutes. He would remember that hallway conversation very clearly later. He would spend a long time after all of this was over asking himself whether there was a version of that afternoon where he'd handled it differently. The honest answer was yes. There were many versions. He just hadn't been in any of them. Ethan spent Tuesday afternoon updating his resume for the first time in 9 years. It was a strange exercise. He opened the old document and stared at it. Maintenance technician, Meridian Aerospace Solutions, 2015 to present. That was what 9 years looked like on paper, according to the official record. He knew the reality, the patents that carried other people's names, the solutions that had become company policy without attribution, the 11 separate instances in which his intervention had prevented what would have been costly project failures. But none of that was in the official record, because Richard Hale was in the official record, and Richard Hale had made sure that the official record said what Richard Hale wanted it to say. He closed the document. He made dinner for Lily, pasta with the olive oil and garlic situation she liked, and helped her with her homework and listened to her read a chapter of her book out loud and put her to bed at 8:30. She asked, just before he turned off her light, whether he was worried. "A little," he said. "Don't be," she said. "You know stuff." He laughed. "That's the plan." After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that got cold while he wasn't drinking it and looked at the window over the sink. The neighbor's back porch light was on. A cat moved through the yard. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about justice, exactly. That word had a performative quality to it that made him distrust it. He was thinking about something more specific, that a B-series seal in a secondary housing was going to fail under extended pressure load, and that when it did, the damage could cascade in ways that would affect good people. People like Marcus, who had a pregnant wife and a house payment, and who had always treated Ethan with straight-up basic human respect. People like the 23 members of the assembly crew who'd spent 14 months building something they believed in. He was thinking that those people were going to get hurt by a mistake that shouldn't have happened, and that the mistake had been allowed to happen because the person who'd flagged it had been convenient to remove. He picked up his phone, looked at Marcus's number, then he set it down. If they wanted his help, they knew where to find him. He went to bed at 10:15. He was asleep by 10:20. He was good at that, compartmentalizing, putting things down. Claire used to say he had the remarkable ability to simply stop worrying when worrying stopped being useful. She'd meant it as a compliment most of the time, and a gentle exasperation other times, depending on the situation. He slept. He didn't dream. In Bay 7, the seal held. For now. Thursday morning, 7 a.m. The extended pressure simulation run for the primary autonomous guidance frame assembly was scheduled to begin at 7:30. Dennis Kowalski arrived at 6:50 with coffee and a tablet running the monitoring software. His team was already set up: 3 engineers, 2 data technicians, 1 external QA rep from the federal contractor side who would observe and certify the results. The bay had been configured over the previous 2 days. Everything, by all available accounts, looked correct. The simulation involved subjecting the guidance frame to sustained mechanical load and thermal cycling across a 6-hour window designed to replicate operational stress conditions. It was, in the context of the project timeline, one of the most important single tests they would run. Pass it, and they moved into the final validation phase. Fail it, and they were looking at a minimum 6-week setback, possible contract renegotiation, and the kind of schedule impact that makes federal program managers reach for their termination for default clauses. Kowalski had run simulations more complex than this one. He was confident in his team. He was confident in the prep work. He was also operating without the information that would have changed his morning. At 7:22, Marcus arrived. He had spent the past 2 days trying to reflag Ethan's concern through every channel he had access to, but the channels were busy, and his title was Assembly Crew Lead, not Engineer, and in the hierarchy of whose concerns got escalated when that distinction mattered. He found Kowalski running through the pre-simulation checklist near the primary monitoring station. "Dennis," he said. Kowalski looked up. "Marcus, we're about to get started." "I know. I need 60 seconds. Marcus kept his voice level because he'd learned that urgent voices get managed while level voices get listened to. Ethan Brooks flagged a component issue before he left Tuesday. Secondary interface bracket, thermal expansion seal. He said the B series was installed during last week's maintenance swap, and it should be C series for the temperature range you're running today. Kowalski blinked, set down his tablet. He flagged it how? Email to you on Tuesday morning, and he told me in person. I mentioned it to you in the hallway Tuesday afternoon. A pause. Something moved across Kowalski's face. The one running the 6-hour extended load today, Marcus said. He specifically mentioned the 6-hour run. Kowalski turned to his closest engineer. Pull the component spec for secondary interface bracket, thermal expansion seal, Bay 7C. Pull it now. It took 4 minutes. The engineer came back with his tablet. The installed component was, in fact, a B-series seal. The rated operating parameters for a B-series seal reached a maximum sustained temperature of "Stop the simulation setup," Kowalski said. The QA rep from the federal side looked up. "We have a 7:30 start window." "I'm aware." Kowalski was already moving toward the housing panel. "We have a component issue that needs to be resolved before we run this." "What kind of issue?" "The kind that causes catastrophic failure under the exact conditions we're about to create." The QA rep's face changed. The bay went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when the people in them have just understood that they were very close to something they did not want to be close to. Kowalski stood in front of panel 7C and stared at it. He thought about the email. He thought about the hallway. He thought about a maintenance technician with a flashlight and a clipboard at 6:47 in the morning. He pulled out his phone and called Denise in HR. "I need to know," he said, "where Ethan Brooks can be reached." The discovery of the seal issue stopped the simulation, but it also opened a door. Kowalski's team, now looking much more carefully at the Bay 7C assembly, found that the B-series seal wasn't the only problem. It was the most immediate problem, the one that would have triggered a cascade failure within the first 90 minutes of the simulation run. But there was also a secondary calibration issue in the data feedback loop and a pre-stress fracture in one of the load-bearing connection points that was small enough to pass a visual inspection but significant enough to matter under sustained load. This was the thing about Ethan's kind of knowledge. It wasn't just that he knew about the seal, it was that he knew about the seal because he'd been monitoring the whole assembly continuously, the way someone monitors a complicated patient, tracking small variations, holding multiple data points in relation to each other, building a picture that no single inspection could replicate. The engineering team didn't have that picture. They had documentation. They had design specs. They had maintenance logs, or the portions of the maintenance logs that hadn't been erased or reclassified over the years. But the connective tissue between those things, the living understanding of how this particular machine behaved under this particular range of conditions, was not in any database. It was in Ethan Brooks, who was currently at home helping his daughter with breakfast before school drop-off. Kowalski spent 3 hours trying to reconstruct the system picture from available documentation. At 11 o'clock, he called a meeting with his senior engineers. At 11:50, he walked upstairs to Olivia Sterling's office for the first time without an appointment. Her assistant started to say something about her calendar. "It's urgent," Kowalski said. "I need 10 minutes." Olivia looked up from her laptop. She had dark circles under her eyes that her makeup mostly covered. She'd been on calls since 6:30. "Dennis," she gestured to the chair across from her desk. "What's happening?" He told her, cleanly, without embellishment. The seal, the simulation, what they'd found when they looked closer, the gap in institutional knowledge that had become visible now that the person who held it was gone. Olivia's expression didn't change much while he talked. That was a habit she'd developed, keeping her face controlled in moments of stress because her face was always being read. But her hand, which had been resting on the desk, flattened slightly. Fingers spread. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the Tuesday termination, the person we terminated Tuesday morning flagged this issue on Tuesday morning," Kowalski said, before he left. The room was quiet. "To you," she said, "by email at 6 a.m. and verbally to his colleague who flagged it to me in the afternoon." He paused. "I didn't act on it in time, that's on me, but the information was there." Olivia leaned back, looked at the ceiling briefly, then at Kowalski. "What do you need to proceed?" "I need the person who understands this system," Kowalski said, "and that person is Ethan Brooks." She was quiet for another moment. "What's the contract exposure if we miss the simulation window?" "We have a 30-day clause, but every day we delay is a day the Federal Program Office has justification to start the clock on performance concerns. And if they open a performance review during the final validation phase, we're looking at—" He stopped. "It's not a good scenario." "I understand." She reached for her phone, then stopped. "What do you know about why he was let go?" "What I know," Kowalski said carefully, "is that I've been here 6 years, and I've never seen anyone understand this equipment the way he does. And I know that his contributions are not well reflected in the formal record, which I should have paid more attention to a long time ago." She looked at him. "That's a polite answer," she said. "It's the honest one I can give you right now with the information I have." She nodded, picked up the phone. "Get me Ethan Brooks' contact information from HR," she said, "and get Richard Hale in my office in 20 minutes. Kowalski stood to leave. "Dennis," he turned back. "Thank you for coming to me directly." "I should have come sooner," he said, and walked out. Ethan's phone rang at 12:14. He was at the kitchen table, laptop open, scrolling through job listings with the particular grim focus of someone who knows that job searching is the thing that needs to happen but finds it deeply unpleasant. He'd had 2 cups of coffee. He'd eaten half a sandwich. He'd sent one email to a former colleague at a competing firm. The number on his screen was Meridian's main switchboard. He looked at it for 4 rings. "Brooks?" he said. "Mr. Brooks?" A professional female voice. Not someone he recognized. "This is Naomi, executive assistant to Olivia Sterling. Ms. Sterling would like to speak with you personally, at your earliest convenience. Are you available for a call in the next few minutes?" He looked at the half-eaten sandwich. "Sure," he said. There was a 40-second hold, then, "Mr. Brooks, this is Olivia Sterling." He'd heard her voice in facility-wide addresses twice. Up close, it was different. Less formal, slightly more careful. "Ms. Sterling, I'm going to be direct with you," she said. "My engineering team brought a situation to my attention this morning. A component issue in Bay 7 that you apparently flagged before you left the facility Tuesday." "That's right." "I want you to know that the issue was caught before the simulation ran. I want to be clear about that." "Good." A pause. She seemed to be choosing her next words with some care. "I'm also learning that the documentation trail around your contributions to this project, and to the company's work more broadly, may not accurately reflect the reality of what you've built here." Another pause. Shorter. "I believe you're owed an apology, and I'm offering one. I made a decision based on information I didn't verify adequately. That was my error." Ethan was quiet for a moment. There was something interesting about the apology. It was genuine. He could tell, in the way that careful people can usually tell. She wasn't performing. She was also, clearly, a person who was managing a crisis and needed something from him, and was smart enough to know that an apology was the necessary first step to getting it. Both things were true at the same time. "Okay," he said. "I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to return temporarily," she said. "In an advisory capacity to help stabilize the simulation program and assess the full scope of the technical situation. I'll be honest, we don't fully understand what we're looking at, and I've been told you may be the only person who does." "Probably true," he said. Another pause. This one had a quality to it. She was recalibrating. "I understand if the answer is no," she said, "given the circumstances." He looked out the window. The yard. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon turned Thursday silence. "I'll come back," he said, "temporarily, under my terms." "What terms?" "I want an independent review of the project record. Who contributed what? Who gets credit for what?" He paused. "I want it conducted by someone outside the company, and I want it to have actual teeth, meaning if it finds what I think it'll find, it leads to actual corrections in the record." The silence on her end was slightly longer than the previous ones. "That's a significant ask," she said. "I know. Can I ask why that's more important to you than, say, compensation?" He thought about Lily at the diner. You know stuff. He thought about 9 years of watching his work carry other people's names. He thought about the way truth has a particular weight when it's been sitting under something for a long time and finally gets some air. "Because the work is the work," he said. "Compensation comes and goes. The record is what's real." A long pause. "I'll agree to those terms," she said. He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "I'll be there at 7 tomorrow morning," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." "Ethan," he said. "Thank you, Ethan." He ended the call and sat still for a minute. Then he picked up the half-eaten sandwich and finished it. At 2:15 that same afternoon, Olivia Sterling sat across from Richard Hale in her office with a specific expression on her face that Richard had not seen before. He had developed, over many years, a finely tuned sensitivity to the faces of executives under pressure. And what this particular face was telling him was that the ground had shifted in ways he hadn't accounted for. He was still confident. He was good in rooms like this. "Richard," she said, "walk me through Ethan Brooks's contribution history on the flagship project." "Of course." He settled back slightly. His role has been primarily in physical systems support. Not his role, his contribution, specifically. She had a folder open in front of her. "The thermal management architecture developed in 2018. Walk me through who developed that." He looked at the folder. "The engineering team, led by..." "Was Ethan Brooks involved?" "In a support capacity, yes. The diagnostic protocol adopted as standard in 2020. Who developed that?" A slightly different quality to the silence now. "That was a team effort." "Richard." She closed the folder. "I've spent the morning talking to engineers who've been on this project for years, and I've started asking specific questions about specific contributions, and I'm getting answers that are different from what I would expect based on the personnel record." She looked at him steadily. "So I want to give you the opportunity to walk me through this directly, because we're going to conduct a full independent record review, and I'd rather you tell me what I'm going to find than have it come out the other way." Richard's face did something subtle. Not guilt. He was past guilt. Something more like the recalculation of a very skilled player who has just recognized that the board position is different from what they believed. "I think," he said carefully, "that there may be some ambiguity in historical attribution that a review could help clarify." "There may be," she agreed. They looked at each other. "I'd like you to take administrative leave," she said. "Effective today. With pay. While the review is conducted." She paused. "That's not a punitive action, Richard. It's a precaution." He took approximately 7 seconds. "Of course," he said. "I understand completely." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of her office with the same practiced composure he had walked into it with. In the elevator down to the lobby, alone, his reflection looked back at him from the polished metal doors. 16 years. An architecture of omission. He had been good at this for a very long time. He wondered for the first time how good the investigators were going to be. Ethan arrived at the Meridian facility the following morning at 6:50. He sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes. Not because he was nervous, because he wanted to be clear in his own head about why he was here. Not for the apology, which had been necessary but insufficient. Not for the role they'd offer him, whatever that turned out to be. He was here because there was a damaged system that needed understanding, and because people he respected were going to be hurt if it wasn't understood, and because he was, at the fundamental level of what he was and how he moved through the world, someone who fixed things. That was it. He picked up his coffee from the cup holder, the same battered travel mug with Lily's handprint on it in orange paint, third-grade art project, and got out of the car. The morning air was cool. Bay 7 lights were on behind the glass. Dennis Kowalski was waiting near the entrance. He looked like he hadn't slept much. He extended his hand. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Tell me everything your team found yesterday," Ethan said, shaking it, "and then take me to the bay." They walked inside. The hum of the fluorescent lights greeted him, still uneven, still slightly too high on the left ballast. He noticed. He always noticed. The bay smelled exactly the same. That was the first thing Ethan noticed when he walked back through the doors of Bay 7. The particular mixture of machine oil, cold metal, and recycled facility air that had been the backdrop of his mornings for 9 years. Some sensory details are so specific to a place that encountering them again is almost disorienting, less like a memory and more like a fold in time. He had stood in this doorway 10,000 times, and the smell had never registered consciously, and now, returning after 2 days, it hit him with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. He let it pass. Kowalski was talking. He'd been talking since the parking lot, the way engineers talk when they're running on stress, and too much coffee and the particular adrenaline of a problem that is larger than they initially understood. Ethan listened without interrupting, which was something Kowalski seemed to appreciate. Most people, he'd noticed, listened in the spaces between what they were about to say. Ethan actually listened. Secondary calibration drift we found in the data feedback loop. Here, on the East Monitor array, our best estimate is it's been developing for somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks. Kowalski pulled up the readout on his tablet and turned it so Ethan could see. We didn't catch it in routine checks because the variance sits just inside the acceptable threshold. It's not triggering any alerts. Ethan looked at the numbers. "It's not 3 to 5 weeks, he said. Kowalski blinked. "Sorry?" "Started 8 weeks ago." He pointed to a specific value on the readout. "You're looking at the variance as a static measurement. It's not static. This is a slow migration pattern. It moves in one direction, pauses, moves again." If you look at the slope of the drift over time, the origination point is further back than you're calculating. Kowalski stared at the tablet, then at Ethan. "How do you—" "I've been watching that readout since we set up this array. I have the baseline in my head." He moved past Kowalski toward panel 7C. "What else did your team find?" It was not arrogance, the way he said it. Arrogance has a performative quality. It wants to be noticed. This was simply the delivery of information by someone who had spent so long operating in the space between what was documented and what was true that a certain directness had become his default mode. Kowalski had been around long enough to recognize the difference. "Pre-stress fracture on the load-bearing connector at junction 14F, Kowalski said, following him. "We flagged it for evaluation, but our assessment is that it's non-critical for the simulation parameters." Ethan stopped, turned. "Who made that assessment?" "Chen ran the numbers. He's solid." "I'm not questioning Chen." Ethan set down his coffee. "I want to see the calculation." Kowalski called out to one of the engineers on the far side of the bay. "Chen, bring the 14F fracture analysis over here." Chen, late 20s, sharp, visibly cautious in the presence of the man everyone had spent Thursday afternoon talking about, crossed the bay with his laptop. He set it on the equipment shelf and pulled up the analysis, explaining it with the slightly defensive precision of someone who has done good work and expects it to be questioned anyway. Ethan read through it. Took about 2 minutes. Chen stood very still. "The calculation is right," Ethan said. "The input assumptions are slightly off." He pointed to a specific parameter. "This load distribution model assumes uniform stress across the connector array, but junction 14F sits at the asymmetric convergence point. The actual load distribution at that location is non-uniform by roughly 18%. He picked up a pencil from the shelf and did 4 lines of arithmetic on the margin of a printed sheet that was sitting nearby. At those actual values, non-critical becomes marginal critical. Chen looked at the numbers. His jaw tightened slightly. Marginal critical means it holds under standard simulation parameters and probably fails under the extended run if there are any other destabilizing factors in play. Ethan handed the pencil back. "Which there are, because we also have the calibration drift. They interact." The bay was quiet for a moment in the particular way it got quiet when multiple people had just understood that a situation was more serious than the previous version of the situation. Kowalski exhaled slowly. So what we have is three interdependent problems, Ethan said, not three separate problems. The seal was the obvious one. It would have failed first and loudest. But even if someone had caught and replaced the seal before the run, the calibration drift and the fracture interaction would have produced a slower failure somewhere in hour 3 or 4. He looked around the bay, at the assembly, at the monitoring stations, at the work that 14 months of people's lives had gone into. Whoever installed that B-series seal during the maintenance swap didn't cause all of this. They just added a trigger to a situation that was already developing. Kowalski rubbed the back of his neck. How long to fix all three? The seal is a half-day job with the right component. The calibration drift. I need to go back through the monitoring logs, identify the origination event, correct from there rather than patching the current state. Otherwise, we're fixing the symptom. He thought for a moment. Call it 2 days for the drift recalibration if nothing surprises me. The fracture. We don't repair that, we replace the connector. Lead time on the part is the variable. We have 14 F connectors in the parts inventory. I had someone check last night. Then we're looking at 4 days minimum, more likely 5 or 6, before I'd feel comfortable recommending the simulation run proceeds. He paused. And I want to be clear. That's my recommendation, not a guarantee. Once we're in the extended run, we're in it. I'm not going to tell you it's safe unless I actually believe it's safe. Kowalski nodded. That's fair. One more thing. Ethan turned to face him directly. I need full access to the maintenance logs, all of them, including archived versions. Kowalski met his eyes. Something passed between them, an understanding that was slightly larger than its surface meaning. I'll authorize it this morning, Kowalski said. Ethan nodded and picked up his coffee. He got to work. The thing about a problem that has been developing across multiple systems over multiple weeks is that fixing it is less like repairing a single broken part and more like doing archaeology. You have to understand the sequence of failures, the way each one enabled the next, before you can confidently address any of them. Ethan worked the way he always worked, which was without a lot of visible drama, but with the kind of steady, concentrated focus that some people find unsettling to watch because it looks too much like certainty, and certainty in the face of complicated problems makes other people aware of their own uncertainty. By noon, he had mapped the calibration drift back to its origin point. A firmware update pushed to the monitoring array by the software team 7 weeks ago that had introduced a fractional timing offset. The offset was small enough that nobody had noticed it in isolation. Over 7 weeks, it had accumulated. By 2 in the afternoon, he had verified the fracture severity independently and confirmed his interaction analysis. By 4, he had drafted a full remediation sequence, not a list of tasks, but an actual sequence, with specific dependencies and decision points, the kind of thing that could only be written by someone who understood how each element of the system related to every other element. He gave it to Kowalski, who read it twice, and then passed it to Chen, who read it and said nothing for about 30 seconds. This is complete, Chen said. He seemed slightly stunned. This is a complete system picture. Yeah, Kowalski said. He was looking at Ethan, who was already back at panel 7C, pulling a secondary connector for examination. Chen lowered the document. He's been carrying this in his head? Apparently. Chen was quiet for a moment. Where's he been for the past 9 years? Kowalski picked up his coffee. According to the official record, maintenance support. He took a sip. According to the actual facts, he's been everywhere. The parts inventory came through at 4:30. The 14F connector was there, as expected. The C-Series thermal seal required a special order from the component supplier, but Kowalski's procurement team pushed it through on an expedited basis and confirmed delivery for the following morning. At 5:15, Ethan stopped. Not because the work was done, but because his body had its own logic, and the logic said food and rest were not optional. He had learned this the hard way in his early 20s, back when he thought sustained effort was the same thing as sustained output, which it isn't. He gathered his tools with the specific methodical care of someone who has been doing this long enough to have a system that he doesn't have to think about. He labeled 3 reference points on the assembly with small pieces of colored tape, his own coding system, not the company standard. Yellow for next immediate task. Blue for dependency. Red for watch point. Chen, who had been working nearby, looked at the tape. Is there a legend for that somewhere? In my head, Ethan said. Can you write it down? Ethan considered this. Yeah, he said. I can write it down. He pulled a notepad from his bag and spent 8 minutes producing what was, effectively, a field manual for the current state of the Bay 7 assembly. Condition, risk, task, sequence, and tape coding key. He tore the pages out and gave them to Chen. Chen looked at them with the expression of someone who has just been handed something valuable and is slightly unsettled by how straightforwardly it was given. Thank you, he said. Don't lose those, Ethan said, and walked out. He called Lily from the parking lot. She was at her after-school program, which she tolerated with the philosophical resignation of a child who knows that after-school programs are non-negotiable and has therefore decided to simply get through them. How was your day? She asked, with the slightly exhausted tone of someone who had been asked this question by adults all afternoon and was now somewhat automatized in both asking and receiving it. Interesting, he said. How was yours? We did fractions. I already knew fractions. I know you did. Tyler Mercer still doesn't know fractions, and I'm not allowed to tell him that because it's not helpful, she said, with the air quotes audible in her voice. Your teacher's probably right. I know she's right. It's still annoying. He smiled. He was in the parking lot of a company that had fired him 3 days ago and called him back in crisis, in the middle of an investigation into 9 years of stolen credit, with a damaged aerospace assembly that needed another 5 days of work before it would be safe to run. And his 7-year-old daughter was annoyed about fractions. The scale difference was, in its way, stabilizing. I'll pick you up in 40 minutes, he said. Can we get tacos? We can get tacos. He drove to the taco place she liked, which was not a chain and was also not particularly clean, but made the kind of carnitas that you could not logically argue against. They sat in a booth with a cracked vinyl seat and ate, and Lily told him about a book she wanted to read that one of her friends had recommended, and he told her he'd look it up, and she told him about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Priya about whether a specific type of dinosaur was a carnivore or an omnivore, and she was already pretty sure she was right and had a plan to look it up at the school library. She did not ask how his day at the facility had gone. She had a sense, at 7, of when to ask and when to simply be present. It was the same sense her mother had had, and every time Ethan encountered it, it ran through him like a very thin wire of grief, quick and precise, and then gone. After tacos, he drove home. After Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table again with the cold tea habit he apparently hadn't broken. He pulled up the maintenance log archive on his laptop — Kowalski had given him remote access that afternoon — and began reading. Not because he needed to, for the technical work. He already knew, in broad strokes, what had happened. But the independent review Olivia Sterling had agreed to would need documentation, and documentation needed a trail, and Ethan had decided that he was not going to leave this to chance or to an external investigator who didn't know where to look. He read for 3 hours. What he found was not surprising, but it was thorough, and thorough in this case meant 12 years of carefully maintained absence, his name missing where it should have been present, his proposals reformatted and reattributed, his solutions absorbed into team documentation that listed team members who hadn't been in the room. It was the work of someone who was patient and detail-oriented and who had understood from early on that control of the record was control of the reality. Richard Hale had been very, very good at it. Ethan made notes in a separate document, not with anger, with the same focused methodology he brought to everything, the same patient accumulation of data points. He organized them chronologically. He cross-referenced dates. He flagged specific instances where the documentary trail was demonstrably incorrect, based on physical evidence that still existed in the facility. Early version drawings with his handwriting, component test logs with his initials that preceded the official development dates by months, an email chain from 2017 that had been partially archived and partially deleted, and whose gaps were themselves informative. At 11:40, he saved the document, encrypted it, sent it to a personal email address, and closed his laptop. He sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet. He wasn't doing this for revenge. He had thought about that on the drive home and arrived at a conclusion that he trusted, which was that revenge requires a kind of sustained focus on someone else's wrongdoing that he didn't have the energy or interest to maintain. What he was doing was something simpler, making sure that when the investigators went looking, they would find what was actually there. Because investigators sometimes look in the wrong places, and Richard Hale had spent 12 years understanding which places those were. He went to bed at midnight. The next morning he was back in Bay 7 at 6:55. There was a quality to early morning facility work that Ethan had always found, if not exactly peaceful, then at least clarifying. Before the administrative layer of the day began, the emails, the meetings, the management of perceptions, there was just the work and the machinery and the honest feedback of physical systems. A component either held or it didn't. A calibration was either accurate or it wasn't. The thing either worked or it told you why it didn't. This was the part of his job that had always felt real to him in a way that was hard to articulate. He spent the morning on the calibration drift recalibration, the most painstaking of the three tasks, requiring him to essentially walk back through 7 weeks of accumulated timing, offset, and restore the monitoring array to its correct baseline. He did it with Marcus assisting, because Marcus had been on the assembly crew since the beginning of the project and knew the physical layout better than anyone except Ethan, and because having someone he trusted beside him while he worked was not a weakness, regardless of what certain management philosophies about self-sufficiency might suggest. Marcus didn't talk much while they worked, which was one of the things Ethan appreciated about him. He asked clear questions when he needed clarification and was quiet the rest of the time, and he had hands that knew what they were doing, which was not a small thing. Around 10:30, while Ethan was deep in the firmware correction interface, Marcus said, "My wife wanted me to tell you thank you." Ethan didn't look up from the screen. For what? For flagging the seal. If the simulation had run and cascaded, he stopped. There were 30 people working this project on Thursday. Some of them have been here since the contract started. A cascade failure that big, this late in the timeline, contract would have been at risk, Ethan said. Contract would have been gone. Marcus's voice was level, but there was something underneath it. 30 people, man. Half of them have families. Ethan saved his current work and looked at Marcus. Tell her I said you're welcome. He paused. And tell her the Carnitas place on Dwyer Avenue is better than the one on 5th. Marcus looked at him. What? She mentioned she was looking for a good taco spot. I overheard you on the phone last month. You remember that? I remember things. Marcus shook his head with an expression that was halfway between exasperation and something warmer. You're a strange man, Ethan. Yeah. He turned back to the firmware interface. I know. By midday Friday, the calibration-recalibration was complete and verified. By Friday afternoon, with Chen and 2 other engineers assisting on the connector replacement, the 14F fracture was addressed. The C-Series thermal seal arrived Saturday morning, as promised, and Ethan installed it himself with Marcus assisting, which took 3.5 hours and involved 2 moments where Ethan stopped and looked at something for a long time without explanation before proceeding, and 1 moment where he asked Marcus to hold a specific tension on a secondary line for exactly as long as it took Ethan to complete the adjacent connector seating, and Marcus held it without asking why, because by now he had learned that there was always a reason. Saturday afternoon, Ethan ran preliminary diagnostics. The feedback loop was clean, the calibration was accurate, the monitoring array was showing exactly what it should be showing, the connector was holding. He ran the diagnostics again, then a 3rd time, because the first time tells you the current state, and the second time confirms it, and the 3rd time tells you whether the current state is stable or whether it's a coincidence. 3 consistent results. He made notes. He did not say it was done. He did not use words like fixed or solved, because those words implied a finality that mechanical systems didn't actually possess. What he said to Kowalski, who had come in on a Saturday because this was the kind of project and the kind of crisis that pulled people in on Saturdays, was, preliminary indicators are where they need to be. I want to run a continuous monitoring cycle for 48 hours before I recommend the simulation window. That takes us to Monday afternoon. Kowalski nodded. That works. The federal QA rep is available Monday. I already checked. Good. There was a brief silence. Kowalski had something on his face that wasn't quite an apology, but was related to one. The expression of someone who has processed a mistake and is living alongside the processing of it, rather than having resolved it into a clean emotion. "You knew about all three problems," Kowalski said. It wasn't exactly a question. The seal was acute. The drift and the fracture interaction I'd been monitoring. Ethan zipped his tool bag. "I was going to raise them in my next maintenance report, which you didn't get to write." "Which I didn't get to write," Ethan agreed. Kowalski looked at the assembly. "I should have read your email Tuesday morning." "Yeah." The word wasn't harsh, it was just accurate. Ethan didn't see the value in softening it, not because he wanted Kowalski to feel worse, but because a clean acknowledgement of a mistake is more useful than a managed one. Kowalski looked like he could handle it, and he was right. "I'll read your emails," Kowalski said. "That would help." Ethan picked up his bag and his now cold coffee and left the bay. In the parking lot, he sat in his car for a minute before starting the engine. He thought about calling Lily, then checked the time and remembered she was at her friend Priya's house for a playdate, and Priya's mom had texted him earlier to say they were doing fine and not to worry. He thought about the document on his laptop at home, the one with 12 years of evidence organized into a timeline. He thought about Richard Hale, who was on administrative leave and whose phone calls, there had been 2, to Ethan directly, he had not returned. He thought about Olivia Sterling, who had called him again yesterday afternoon with a brief update. She had been crisper than the first call, less careful, not because she was less thoughtful, but because the initial careful register of the first conversation had given way to something more functional. She had told him the independent review firm had been engaged. She had named them, and he had recognized the name. Solid outfit, not industry-aligned, good reputation for forensic documentation work. She had said they expected to begin on Monday. "I want to be honest with you about something," she had said, in a tone that suggested she was about to be honest about something she'd rather not be. "Okay? When I made the decision Tuesday morning, I thought I was making a straightforward operational call, streamlining." A pause. "I accepted a framing of the situation without verifying it independently. I've been running acquisitions for 3 years, and I have systems for due diligence that I trust, and I didn't apply them here because it was presented as a personnel matter rather than a technical one." Another pause. "I'm telling you this not because you need to hear it, but because I think it's relevant to what you're doing with the record review." Ethan had thought about that for a moment. Why? Because whoever framed it to me as purely a personnel matter made a deliberate choice about how to categorize it. And that choice kept you in one of those review silos where the rules about who verifies what didn't require me to look at the technical record. She paused. It was clean. It was precise. It was designed. "Yes," Ethan said. "It was." She said nothing for a moment. "I'm not asking you to tell me more than you're comfortable telling me right now. The investigators will do that." "I've compiled some material that should help them," he said. "I'll send it to you before Monday." There was a slightly longer pause than he expected. "You've already been building a documentation file." "Since Tuesday night." The pause this time was even longer. "Ethan," she said. Then she seemed to decide against whatever she'd been about to say. "Thank you." "Yeah." He sat with the memory of that call in the parking lot for another minute. Then he started the car and drove home. Lily was back from Priya's by 6. She had brought a book with her, the dinosaur one she'd mentioned at the taco place, borrowed from Priya's shelf, which she held out to him as she came through the door with the triumphant expression of someone whose advanced planning has paid off. "I was right," she said. "It's an omnivore." Priya looked it up at the library, and it turns out I was wrong too, but we were less wrong than Tyler would have been. "That's not really how being right works," Ethan said. "I know." She dropped her bag in the hallway, which was a thing he told her not to do at least 3 times a week. "I'm just saying I was in the right general direction." He picked up the bag and hung it on the hook by the door. "Go wash your hands." She disappeared toward the bathroom. He went to the kitchen and started making dinner. Pasta again, because Friday nights had a pasta logic to them that had developed organically over the years, and he'd stopped questioning it. While the water was heating, he leaned against the counter and looked around the kitchen. The drawing on the refrigerator from Lily's art class. the slightly crooked cabinet door he'd been meaning to fix for 4 months, the mug rack Claire had found at a thrift store, and that he would never replace because it was one of those objects that had absorbed enough time to become irreplaceable. An ordinary kitchen on an ordinary Friday evening. Outside, somewhere across the city, Richard Hale was in his house on administrative leave, doing whatever people like Richard did when the architecture they'd built started to develop cracks. Somewhere across the city, Olivia Sterling was probably on another call, or reviewing another document, or working through the specific consequences of having made a decision based on wrong information and trying to figure out what making it right actually looked like in practice. And on Monday morning, investigators from an independent firm would walk into Meridian Aerospace Solutions with a mandate and a timeline, and they would start looking at the places Richard had never expected anyone to look, because he had spent 12 years making sure no one ever had reason to. Ethan put the pasta in when the water boiled. Lily came back from the bathroom and climbed onto the kitchen stool and started reading the dinosaur book with the focused intensity of someone who has won a minor intellectual victory and is consolidating the gains. "Dad," she said, without looking up. "Yeah." "Are things getting better?" He stirred the pasta. "Getting there," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and turned a page. The kitchen smelled like garlic and olive oil. The crooked cabinet door was still crooked. The mug rack was still there. 9 miles away, in Bay 7, the monitoring system ran its first hour of continuous check. The calibration was accurate. The connectors held. The feedback loop was clean. Everything that was supposed to work was working. For now, and in the business of aerospace engineering, for now was what you had, and what you built on, and what you protected with every careful hour of attention you could give it. Ethan poured the pasta into the colander and steam rose toward the ceiling. He called Lily to dinner. The investigators arrived on Monday morning in a gray sedan which felt appropriate. There were 2 of them. A woman named Sandra Voss, who ran the firm and had spent 22 years doing forensic documentation work across industries ranging from pharmaceuticals to defense manufacturing, and her associate, a younger man named Paul Garrett, who carried a laptop bag and said very little and had the kind of attentive stillness that meant he was processing everything. They wore business casual and carried coffee from a place that wasn't the facility cafeteria and shook hands with a minimum of ceremony. Ethan met them in the lobby at 8 o'clock because Olivia had asked him to, and also because it was his documentation file they'd be working from, at least in part, and he wanted to make sure they understood how it was organized before they started pulling threads. Sandra Voss had a firm handshake and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she lowered when she looked at documents and raised when she looked at people, which was a distinction Ethan noticed and respected. "We've reviewed what you sent Friday," she said after the introductions. They were in the small conference room adjacent to the lobby, door closed. "It's thorough." "There's more in the physical record," Ethan said. "The digital trail was managed carefully. The physical record is harder to manage because it requires physically removing or altering objects, and that's riskier. There are early version drawings with my handwriting in the archive storage on sub-level 2. There are component test logs going back to 2016 that have my initials and dates that predate the official development records by months in some cases." Sandra made a note. "You know the archive storage layout?" "I know the whole building layout." Paul Garrett looked up from his laptop. "After 9 years in maintenance," Ethan said, "you end up in most corners of a facility at least once. I've been in that archive room probably 40 times. "We'll need you available for questions," Sandra said. "Not necessarily formally. We're not deposing you. We're building a record. But when we find something we don't understand, we may need context. I'll make myself available. One more thing." She set down her pen. "This kind of review, when it uncovers what it uncovers, it tends to get uncomfortable before it gets resolved. People get defensive. Sometimes people get lawyered up quickly and start pushing back on process. I want you to know that the scope of our engagement is defined by Ms. Sterling directly, and it won't be narrowed by other parties." She said it matter-of-factly, not dramatically, just information. "So if you hear things from people trying to reframe the situation or manage what comes out, take it with appropriate skepticism." Ethan looked at her. "You're telling me Richard is going to push back?" "I'm telling you that people who've maintained a version of events for a long time don't usually stop maintaining it because an investigation starts. They usually double down and look for procedural angles. She picked up her pen again. It doesn't change what the documents say. I just want you to be prepared for noise. He nodded. I've been prepared for noise for 9 years, he said. It's not a new experience. Sandra Voss looked at him for a moment with the particular assessment of someone who has done this work long enough to distinguish between people who are steady and people who are performing steadiness. She seemed to arrive at a conclusion. All right, she said. Let's get started. The first day of the investigation was mostly quiet from Ethan's perspective. He was in Bay 7 running the continuous monitoring cycle, watching the 48-hour check progress toward its Monday afternoon completion point, while Sandra and Paul worked through the document archive with access codes Olivia had authorized at the highest level. Kowalski's team was on standby for the simulation run, which was tentatively scheduled for Tuesday if the monitoring cycle completed cleanly. At 11:15, Sandra came down to the bay to ask Ethan about a specific document from 2017, an engineering analysis report on thermal load distribution that bore Richard Hale's name and which Sandra had cross-referenced against a file date that didn't match the metadata. File was created in April 2017, she said, showing him the document on her tablet. The metadata on the original draft directory shows the document was first opened and edited by a user account registered to E. Brooks. The document that appears in the official record has been reformatted and reattributed, but the embedded version history was only partially cleared. She looked at him over her glasses. Is this the thermal management proposal you mentioned in your notes? Ethan looked at it. Something moved through him. Not quite the emotion of the original moment, but its echo. He'd written that proposal at his kitchen table on a weekend, 3 years before Lily was born, when Claire was still alive and used to bring him tea while he worked and ask him to explain what he was doing and actually listen to the explanation. Yes, he said. That's it. Sandra made a note. There are traces like this throughout. It's going to take us several days to fully document. I know. He handed the tablet back. There's an email chain in the 2017 archive folder that's partially deleted. The first 6 messages are missing, but the thread resumes at message 7. The gap in the thread is important. How important? The gap covers the period between when I submitted the proposal to Richard and when the reformatted version appeared under his name. If the deleted messages were recoverable, they'd show the submission chain. Sandra looked at him. Deleted emails from 2017 would typically require forensic data recovery. The IT archive server has a full backup from that period. I know this because I was in the IT room in 2018 when the server was physically moved during the facility renovation and the backup drive was labeled. He paused. I know where things are. She wrote something in her notebook. I'll have Paul request that drive. She went back upstairs. Ethan went back to his monitoring cycle. At 2 in the afternoon, his phone buzzed with a number he recognized. Richard Hale's personal cell. The second call since Thursday. He watched it ring and didn't answer. 20 minutes later, a text. Ethan, I'd like the chance to speak with you directly before this process goes further. There are things you don't have full context on. I think we could resolve this in a way that's better for both of us. He read it twice. Set the phone face down on the equipment shelf. Marcus, who had seen the expression on Ethan's face without meaning to, didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Hale? Yeah. What's he saying? That there are things I don't have full context on and we could resolve this better for both of us. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a word. That's what I thought, Ethan said, and picked up his calibration tool. The monitoring cycle completed at 4:47 Monday afternoon. Clean. All 3 systems showing exactly what they should. Ethan documented the results, signed the completion record, and gave Kowalski the go-ahead for Tuesday's simulation window. Kowalski read through the completion documentation with the thoroughness of a man who had learned, at some cost, to actually read documentation before acting on it. I'm comfortable with this, he said. Good. 8 o'clock tomorrow? I'll be here. He drove home in the early evening light. Lily was with their neighbor, Janet, a retired school teacher who had become an informal fixture in their life after Claire died. Not because Ethan had asked her to be, but because Janet was the kind of person who showed up without making a production of it and kept showing up until it was simply part of the structure of things. She was at their kitchen table helping Lily with a geography worksheet when he came in, and she looked up and said, "There's pasta bake in the oven. I made extra," with the complete casualness of someone who has long since moved past asking whether her help is wanted. "Thank you, Janet," he said. She went back to the worksheet. "Lily says you've been back at the company." "Temporarily." "Good." She pointed to something on the worksheet. "Lily, this one." Lily bent over the worksheet with the expression of someone who is not entirely certain but is committed to the appearance of certainty. Ethan hung up his jacket and went to the kitchen and confirmed the pasta bake situation, which was, objectively, better than anything he would have made tonight. He stood at the counter for a moment and let the ordinary evening sounds of the house settle around him. Lily and Janet debating whether a particular river was in the right country, the oven's low heat hum, a car passing outside. After dinner, and after Janet went home, and after Lily was in bed, Ethan sat with his laptop again. Not reviewing documents this time, Sandra's team was handling that, but doing something he'd been putting off, which was beginning to write down everything he knew in plain language. Not a legal document, not a formal report, just a first-person account of what had happened, when, and how. The kind of thing that, if the investigation somehow got blocked or redirected or managed into a different shape, would exist somewhere as a plain statement of truth. He wrote for 2 hours. He was not a natural writer, His natural language was spatial and technical, and he had to translate constantly between what he understood and what words could carry. But he was precise, and precision was more useful than eloquence in this context. He described the 2017 proposal. He described 6 other specific instances he remembered clearly. He described a conversation with Richard in 2019 in which Richard had told him, with the particular careful phrasing of someone who has rehearsed a thing, that the engineering team had synthesized his input with their own work on a diagnostic protocol, which was Richard's way of saying that the protocol Ethan had developed had been absorbed into the team record without his name on it. He'd known, in that 2019 conversation, exactly what was happening. He'd also made a calculation, not a proud one, but an honest one, that fighting it would cost more than it was worth, that he had a daughter and a mortgage and no guarantee that a fight would change anything, and that the work itself was still there, even if his name wasn't on it. The work was real. The machines knew who'd fix them, in the sense that machines know anything, which is to say they worked the way they were supposed to work because of the specific choices that specific person had made. He had made peace with that calculation for years. He was not sure, sitting at the kitchen table now, whether he still made peace with it. The version of himself who'd made that calculation had been operating under the assumption that it was the only realistic option. That assumption was now being tested. He saved the document at 11:40 and went to bed. Tuesday morning, the federal QA representative arrived at 8:10, coffee in hand, with the brisk efficiency of someone who does this for a living and knows exactly what they're looking at. His name was Hendricks, and he had a reputation, according to Kowalski, for being demanding and accurate, which were the only qualities that mattered in his position. The simulation began at 8:30. The first hour was quiet. Monitoring data came in clean and consistent. The calibration held. The connector held. The seal held. Ethan stood near the secondary monitoring station and watched the data with the specific quality of attention that looks like calm from the outside but is, internally, more like high-resolution alertness, processing multiple data streams simultaneously and comparing them against his accumulated understanding of how this particular assembly behaved, looking for the deviation that would tell him something the instruments might not catch until later. Nothing deviated. At 9:45, Hendricks came to stand beside him. "You the maintenance tech who flagged the seal issue?" he said, without preamble. "I flagged it before I was terminated," Ethan said, "and came back after." Hendricks looked at the monitoring readouts. "I heard there was also a calibration problem and a structural fracture that your team wasn't aware of." "My team," Ethan said carefully, "is a loose description of the situation, but yes." Hendricks was quiet for a moment, watching the data. "The interaction model you identified, drift combined with fracture loading under extended stress, I reviewed it this morning. Kowalski walked me through it." He paused. It's a sophisticated analysis. It's what the system was telling me, Ethan said. You learn to listen. Hendricks looked at him. He had the slightly evaluating expression of someone who has heard a lot of people claim to know things and has developed good filters for distinguishing genuine knowledge from performed expertise. How long have you worked this system? He asked. This specific configuration, about 14 months, from initial assembly. The underlying architecture I've been working with variants of for 9 years. And your title here is maintenance technician. Ethan looked at the monitoring readout. Until last Tuesday it was. Hendricks didn't say anything to that. He looked at the data for another minute and then walked back to his observation position. The simulation ran through hour 2, hour 3. The data was consistent. At hour 4, there was a slight variance in the thermal readout on the east array, slight enough that the automated alert threshold wasn't triggered, but Ethan caught it, flagged it verbally to Chen, and they watched it together for 12 minutes until it stabilized back to nominal. What was that? Chen asked. Thermal gradient fluctuation from the HVAC system. Bay temperature dropped 2 degrees when the exterior door on the west side opened. Ethan pointed to the timestamp. It's in the environmental log, not a system issue. Chen looked at the environmental log, found the corresponding entry, and nodded slowly. You caught that in real time. It's what I do. The simulation completed at 2:30. 6 hours, continuous load, sustained thermal cycling. Every parameter within specification. Hendricks spent 40 minutes reviewing the data output with Kowalski and his team, asking specific questions and receiving specific answers, and at 3:20 he signed the certification. The simulation had passed. Kowalski shook Ethan's hand in the bay afterward with the grip of someone who means it, and Ethan shook it back, and that was essentially all that needed to be said about the immediate technical situation. What needed more saying was happening one floor up, in the conference room where Sandra Voss and Paul Garrett had now been working for 3 days. On Wednesday morning, Sandra called Ethan upstairs. She had organized the conference room in the way investigators organize spaces. Documents in specific stacks, a whiteboard with a timeline written across it in black marker, 2 laptops open. Paul was on one of them, navigating a database Ethan couldn't see from where he sat. I want to walk you through what we've found, Sandra said. She took him through it methodically. The thermal management proposal from 2017 was confirmed. Version history recovered from the IT backup drive showing E. Brooks as originating author with a subsequent reformatting and reattribution that occurred 4 days later. A diagnostic protocol from 2019. She showed him the original draft, which was in his file format, and used his notation conventions, followed by the official version that appeared in the company record under engineering team development with no individual attribution. In documentation like this, Sandra said, there's often a legitimate argument that team iterations make individual attribution complicated. We see that defense a lot, but in this case, the original draft is structurally complete. There are no meaningful substantive additions between the original and the official version. The changes are formatting, notation standardization, and the removal of the originating author field. She went on. 7 other specific instances, each with documentation trails that told similar stories. A patent filing from 2020, Meridian held 3 patents related to the flagship project's guidance architecture. And Sandra had traced the technical specifications in 2 of them back to working documents that Ethan had generated, with the connecting chain only partially obscured because the partial archiving in the IT system had preserved things that were meant to be gone. The most significant thing, Sandra said, is the patent filings. She set a document in front of him. Under the attribution as filed, the technical inventor is listed as the engineering development team, which is a collective attribution that designates Richard Hale as the responsible team lead. The underlying technical specifications, however, are traceable in their origin to documents you generated. She looked at him over her glasses. This is no longer just a question of performance record management. Patent attribution has legal dimensions. Ethan looked at the patent document. He had known, in an abstract way, that patents existed and that his work had fed into them. He had not tracked the specific attributions because the legal architecture of intellectual property in a corporate context had always felt opaque and distant from the physical work he did every day. He felt something now that was harder to name than anger. something closer to the sensation of seeing the full scope of a thing you'd been living inside of, from the outside, all at once. The way a map shows you a territory you've been navigating by feel. "What happens now?" he said. "We complete our documentation. We deliver a findings report to Ms. Sterling, probably by end of week. At that point, the decisions about what to do with the findings are hers and the company's." Sandra paused. "I've been doing this for a long time. The documentary evidence here is clear. What happens to Richard Hale is a separate question that involves HR, potentially legal counsel, potentially the patent office. But the factual question of what the record shows is, at this point, not a close call." Ethan nodded. "I want to ask you something directly," Sandra said. She leaned back slightly. "You had access to some of this evidence, the maintenance logs, the archive records, for years. Did you ever attempt to formally raise this?" He had expected this question. He'd asked it of himself many times. "I raised technical concerns through proper channels routinely," he said. "Those got managed. I raised a concern about attribution directly with Richard in 2019, and he told me that the company's IP policy meant that innovations developed in the course of employment belonged to the team, not the individual. He quoted the employment agreement." He paused. "Which I'd signed, and which does say that. What it doesn't cover is someone actively erasing your originating authorship and replacing it with their own name. Did you consult anyone? Legal counsel, union representation?" "No union at Meridian. I looked into an employment attorney in 2020. Didn't pursue it." He said this flatly, not defensively. "I had a 7-year-old and a single income and no certainty that pursuing it would lead anywhere except me being out of a job sooner. I made a calculation." He looked at her. "It wasn't the right calculation, but it was the one I made." Sandra studied him for a moment. "For the record, it wasn't an irrational calculation given the information you had and the resources available to you." "No," he agreed. "It just turned out not to matter because they fired me anyway." She looked at him for another moment. Then she gathered the documents back into their stack. "Thank you," she said. "We'll be in touch as we finalize." He went back downstairs. The thing he hadn't said to Sandra, because it was true, and because it felt too raw to say to someone he'd known for 3 days, was that the moment he'd felt most clearly, walking back through the documents the previous Friday night, was not anger at Richard. Or not only anger, it was something more tangled, the recognition that he had participated in his own erasure not through weakness exactly, but through a series of small practical decisions that had added up to a structural silence. He had stayed. He had kept working. He had told himself the work was enough. He understood why he'd done it. He had a daughter who needed a father who came home with a paycheck and not a lawsuit, and he had a grief that had taken years to metabolize enough that he could function at full capacity again. And he had a practical intelligence that knew the difference between the fight worth having and the one that costs everything. Claire would have fought harder, he thought sometimes. She had a quality of precise fearlessness that he admired and could not replicate. But Claire wasn't here. He was. And here, it turned out, was the place where the accumulated evidence eventually made silence difficult to maintain. He was in Bay 7 running post-simulation checks at 4:30 when Olivia Sterling appeared at the bay entrance. She didn't come in this way often. She came from the administrative side, through the upper-level walkway, and the appearance of a 30-year-old billionaire in a blazer at the bay floor entrance had a mild disrupting effect on the 2 technicians who were working in the far corner. Ethan saw her and finished what he was documenting before acknowledging her, which was not rudeness. It was the physical courtesy of someone who knows that interrupting the final step of a documentation sequence creates errors. She waited. "Ms. Sterling," he said when he'd finished. "Olivia," she said, "you've been calling me Ms. Sterling for a week." "Olivia." She looked around the bay, at the assembly that had, as of this afternoon, passed its critical simulation, at the monitoring stations, at the equipment that Ethan had spent nearly a decade inhabiting. "Sandra briefed me this morning," she said. "Preliminary findings. I know. I wanted to speak with you before the formal report." She looked at him directly. She had dark circles under her eyes that were less covered than last week. "I've been in business for 8 years. I've done 4 acquisitions. I have systems, due diligence processes that I trust because they've worked. She stopped. I'm telling you that I did not know. I want you to understand that's not a legal statement. It's a personal one. I am telling you that I did not know what was in that file, and I did not know what was in the record, and I did not know who you were. I believe you, Ethan said. She seemed slightly surprised by the directness of it. I'm not saying that to make you feel better, he said. I believe you because the way Richard managed information was designed to work on people exactly like you. New, time-pressured, working through trusted intermediaries. It's not a character failure to be successfully deceived by someone who's been refining the deception for 12 years. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the subtle rearrangement of a face that has been holding a particular tension and has just been given permission to relax it slightly. That's a more generous framing than I expected, she said. It's accurate, he said. Generous and accurate aren't always different. She looked out at the assembly for a moment. The simulation passed. Yes. Because of you. Because of a team that did the work correctly once they had the right information. He paused. I provided some of the information. The team did the work. She almost smiled. You're difficult to compliment. I'm accurate about credit allocation, he said, which is kind of the whole issue here. This time she did smile, briefly and a little tiredly. Yes, it is. She turned back to him. I want you to know that whatever the formal report recommends, my intention is to correct the record fully, not selectively. The patents, the documentation, the attribution, all of it. She paused. That's going to involve some legal and regulatory processes I don't fully control. But as far as what this company does and what this company's official record says, I control that. I appreciate that, Ethan said. I'd also like you to consider staying, she said, not in maintenance, in a role that reflects what you actually do. I don't have a title for it yet because I don't think the existing org chart has a box that fits, but one thing at a time, he said. She looked at him. The investigation is still running, he said. The record isn't corrected yet. Richard hasn't been formally addressed yet. I'm not going to make decisions about the future until the present is settled. He said it without edge. Just the logic of it. She nodded. Fair. But I'm not ruling it out, he said. She picked up on the slight change in register. Okay, she said. One thing at a time. She looked around the bay one more time. At the machines, the panels, the labeled tape on the assembly that was still there in Ethan's three-color system. Most of the tape removed now, job done. But one yellow piece still marking a watch point he'd identified and wanted to monitor through the next maintenance cycle. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Why did you stay as long as you did? I've been trying to understand the timeline. The pattern goes back to 2013, 2014. You had enough to act on years before this. He looked at the watch point tape on the assembly, the yellow piece, small and specific against the metal. I had a daughter to raise, he said, and a job that let me do the work I'm good at, even if it didn't pay me what I was worth or put my name on what I built. He paused, and I think, for a long time, I believed that the work being real was enough, that it didn't matter who got credit on paper because the machines worked and the project succeeded and the people who depended on those projects had their jobs. He looked at her. That was not entirely wrong, but it also wasn't entirely right. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It wasn't. She left the bay the way she'd come in. Ethan stood in the quiet for a minute. The fluorescent lights hummed, left ballast still slightly high. He noticed. He always noticed. Then he picked up his documentation and continued working. By Thursday, Sandra Voss's team had recovered and cataloged 43 discrete instances of misattribution spanning 11 years. The number was larger than Ethan had anticipated, not because he hadn't known the scope of what Richard had done, but because the formal enumeration of it, laid out in a numbered list in a forensic document, had a weight that his internal knowledge of it had never quite carried. Knowing something and seeing it written down by an independent party are different experiences, and the difference between them was something he felt in his chest on Thursday afternoon when Sandra walked him through the preliminary list. 43. He had rebuilt this company's most valuable technologies in the margins of a maintenance technician's job description, and someone had spent 11 years carefully removing his fingerprints from each one. "Are you all right?" Sandra asked. He realized he'd been quiet for longer than intended. "Yeah," he said. "I'm all right." He drove home that night and made dinner and helped Lily with her homework and put her to bed. He sat at the kitchen table afterward and didn't open his laptop. He just sat. He thought about Claire, not with grief exactly, not the acute kind, more with the particular longing of wanting to tell someone something, the impulse to share a moment with a specific person who is no longer there to share it with. She would have had something useful to say. She always had, when he was in the middle of something he didn't have clear language for. Instead, he sat with the silence of the kitchen on a Thursday night, the neighbor's porch light, the cat in the yard, 43 instances, 11 years. He was 32 years old, and they had just found out, formally and on paper, that a significant portion of what had made Meridian Aerospace Solutions competitive in its market had come from a man whose name was not in any of the relevant documents. He thought about the version of himself who had made the calculation in 2020, who had looked at the cost of fighting and decided it was too high. He still understood that version of himself. He wasn't angry at him, but he thought that version of himself would have felt something, sitting here now, knowing that the record was about to be corrected. Not triumphant. Ethan didn't really do triumphant. It wasn't in his range. Something quieter. The specific satisfaction of a system being restored to its correct state. The work had always been real. Now, finally, the paper was going to say so too. He got up and washed his mug in the sink. Outside, the night held its ordinary shape. Friday morning, Sandra Voss called at 8:15 to say the formal report would be delivered to Olivia Sterling by end of day. She thanked Ethan for his cooperation and said, professionally and without sentimentality, that it had been a well-documented case and that the evidence was clear. "What happens to Richard?" Ethan asked. "That's outside my scope," she said. "My deliverable is the factual record. What the company does with it and whether there are legal consequences beyond the company is a separate process." "I understand." "For what it's worth," she said, and then she paused in a way that suggested the next part was slightly outside her usual register. "In 22 years, I've done a lot of these reviews. The documentation someone builds when they've been managing a deception for this long is usually full of gaps and inconsistencies because maintaining a lie across 11 years is genuinely difficult and people get sloppy." Another pause. His was unusually clean. You had to know exactly where to look. "I knew where to look," Ethan said, "because I was the one who built the things he was hiding." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly why." She ended the call. He was in Bay 7 at 9 o'clock, running a routine check. The assembly was calm. The calibration was holding. The 14F connector was performing exactly as it should. The C-Series seal sat in its housing with the quiet reliability of a component doing what it was designed to do. Marcus came in at 9:15, coffee in hand, cap low. "Heard the report's going to Sterling today," he said. "That's what I'm told." Marcus looked at the assembly. He was quiet for a moment in the way he sometimes went quiet when he was working up to something he wasn't sure how to say. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "everyone in this bay, the assembly crew, the technicians, the people who've worked with you for years, they know. They've always known." He shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with the weight of what he was saying. They couldn't say it officially or do anything about it, but they knew it was yours. Ethan looked at the assembly, at the work that 11 years of mornings had gone into. "Yeah," he said. "I know they did." He picked up his calibration tool. "Thanks, Marcus," he said. Marcus nodded and went to his station, and the bay settled into its working rhythm, and the fluorescent lights hummed at their slightly uneven frequency, and the machines did what machines do when the right people have taken care of them. They held. Sandra Voss's report landed on Olivia Sterling's desk at 4:53 on Friday afternoon, 87 pages, appendices included. Olivia read the executive summary standing up because she'd been sitting for 6 hours and her back was starting to register its objections. And then she sat down anyway because by page 4 of the summary she needed to be still. She read the whole thing before she called anyone. It took until 7:20. Her assistant had gone home at 6. The building had gone mostly quiet around her, the particular quality of quiet that large facilities develop after hours, when the machinery settles into its maintenance hum and the human layer of noise withdraws. She sat in her office with the report and a cold cup of coffee and read every page. She had built her professional life on information, on knowing how to evaluate a situation quickly, how to identify the essential facts inside a mass of data, how to make decisions in the gap between what was known and what needed to be acted on. She was good at it. She had been good at it since she was in her early 20s, running financial models for a firm that paid her well to be precise and fast and right. But there was a difference. She was understanding now between the kind of information that arrived in models and projections and due diligence reports, information that described systems and structures and probabilities, and the kind that arrived when you read 87 pages of documented evidence about what a real person had done to another real person over 11 years. She closed the report at 7:22. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Then she picked up her phone and called her legal counsel. The call lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, 3 things were certain. Richard Hale's administrative leave would convert to a termination for cause, effective Monday. The company's legal team would engage with the patent office regarding the attribution issues in the 2 affected filings. And the internal documentation correction process, restoring Ethan's name to the records from which it had been removed, would begin as a formal company initiative, not an informal cleanup, with an assigned team and a documented methodology. Her counsel asked whether she'd spoken to Ethan yet about the findings. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "You should have someone from legal present for that conversation." "No," she said. "I shouldn't." Her counsel paused. "Olivia, this isn't a legal conversation. It's a human one." She picked up the report. "I'll loop legal in afterward." She ended the call. She thought about the 43 instances, the 11 years, the thermal management proposal that Ethan had apparently written at his kitchen table, and that had become the technical backbone of a product line that had kept this company competitive for the better part of a decade. She thought about Tuesday morning, the decision she'd made in 40 seconds based on a folder she hadn't verified. She put the report in her bag and turned off her office light and drove home. Ethan got the call Saturday morning at 8:45. He was making pancakes. Saturday morning pancakes were their tradition, had been since Lily was 4, and the tradition held regardless of whatever the surrounding week looked like, which was something he'd been deliberate about because certain ordinary things needed to stay ordinary when the larger context was in motion. Lily was at the kitchen table drawing something complicated involving what appeared to be a castle and several horses, with the focused energy of someone who has a clear internal vision and limited patience for the gap between what she can picture and what her hand can produce. His phone buzzed on the counter. Olivia's number. He turned the burner to low. Answered. "I finished the report last night," she said. She sounded different than the previous calls, less managed, not unprofessional, but with the slight rawness of someone who has processed something significant and is speaking from the other side of it rather than around it. "I wanted to call you before Monday." "Okay." 43 instances, she said. 11 years. A pause. "I don't have a single word for what I think about that. I've been trying to find one since last night, and I haven't." Ethan was quiet. "I want you to know that Richard Hale's employment is being terminated for cause on Monday. The patent office process is starting. The record correction is being formalized as a company initiative. Not a quiet internal fix, a documented process with accountability and a timeline." She paused. "That's not going to undo 11 years. I'm not going to tell you it makes it right. I'm just telling you what we're doing." "I appreciate you telling me directly," he said. "I owe you more than a phone call," she said. "I know that." From the table, Lily looked up at him briefly, assessed that he was on an important call, and returned to her horses. "One of the things in the report," Olivia said, "is a note from Sandra Voss about the condition under which this came to light. The investigation, the evidence. It all traces back to you flagging the seal issue on the morning you were terminated, and to your decision to come back when we called." She stopped. "If you hadn't flagged it, the simulation would have run. If it had run—" "I know what would have happened," Ethan said. "So do I. Now." Another pause, and this one had a different quality, less formal. "Why did you?" After what had just happened that morning, They walked you out with a security escort. Why did you stop and flag the seal issue on your way out? He looked at the pancakes on the griddle, at Lily's drawing, at the ordinary Saturday morning kitchen. Because it needed to be flagged, he said. She was quiet for a moment. That's it? That's it. Another pause. Most people, she said slowly, in that situation would have kept walking. I know, he said. But the problem was real regardless of what had just happened to me. The people working that project didn't do anything wrong. Marcus didn't do anything wrong. He paused. I don't see how the problem gets less real because I'm angry. She took a moment with that. No, she said, finally. I suppose it doesn't. After the call ended, Ethan turned the burner back up. Lily didn't look up from her drawing. Was that the company lady? She asked. Yes. Good things or bad things? Some of both, he said. Mostly good. She nodded and added a detail to one of the horses. How many pancakes are we having? How many do you want? 4. You're not going to eat 4. I'm going to try to eat 4. He put 4 pancakes on the griddle. Monday arrived with the particular low-pressure weight of a day that several people have been building toward, and that is going to move regardless of whether anyone is ready. Ethan was at Meridian at 7:50. He went to Bay 7 first, as he always did, and ran a quick check on the assembly. Post-simulation monitoring was still ongoing, which he'd recommended continuing for another week, and then he went upstairs. The conversation about Richard had already happened, apparently. Denise from HR, who passed Ethan in the hallway with the expression of someone navigating a minefield of other people's feelings, confirmed quietly that Richard had been notified. The termination for cause was done. Ethan nodded and continued to the conference room where Olivia had asked him to come. She was there with 2 people he hadn't met, a woman introduced as the company's general counsel and a man from the documentation correction team who had a legal pad and was clearly there to take notes and implement whatever was decided. Also present was Kowalski, which Ethan found slightly surprising until he understood in the first few minutes of the meeting that Olivia had included him deliberately. Kowalski was the technical anchor, the person who could verify the engineering accuracy of the record correction claims as they worked through them. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. It was not comfortable, and Olivia didn't try to make it comfortable, which Ethan respected. They went through the 43 instances category by category, what the current record said, what the corrected record should say, what the evidentiary basis was, and what the process for making the correction would be. For each one, Ethan confirmed or clarified. Kowalski provided technical context where relevant, and the legal counsel and the documentation person worked out the procedural path. There were several instances where the correction was straightforward: internal records, attributions on project documentation, technical reports. There were several where it was more complex, involving documentation that had been shared externally with partners or clients. And there were the 2 patents, which were their own separate path involving the patent office, and a legal process that the general counsel walked through in careful detail. The patent correction process, the general counsel said, is not fast. The patent office has its own review timeline. We're looking at months, not weeks. And the outcome is not entirely within the company's control. We can initiate the correction request and provide the supporting documentation, but the patent office makes the final determination. I understand that, Ethan said. I want to make sure you have accurate expectations. I have accurate expectations, he said. I'm not expecting this to be simple or fast. I'm expecting it to be correct. The general counsel looked at him and seemed to decide he meant it. They worked through the rest of the list. By the end, the documentation team had a full task matrix and a timeline. The internal corrections would be completed within 60 days. The external communications to partners would be handled on a case-by-case basis. The patent process would be initiated within 2 weeks. After the others left, Olivia asked Ethan to stay for a few minutes. The room had the slightly exhausted atmosphere of a space where significant things have just been processed. Papers on the table, 2 coffee cups. The legal pad with the documentation team's notes still sitting at the far end. I want to revisit the conversation about your role here, she said. He leaned back in his chair. I said one thing at a time. The record correction is in motion. The simulation passed. Richard is gone. She looked at him. How many things at a time? He almost smiled. Fair point. I've had conversations with Kowalski, with some of the senior engineers, with people on the assembly crew who've worked with you. I want to be direct about what I'm thinking. She folded her hands on the table. You have a kind of knowledge that doesn't appear on an org chart and doesn't get captured in a job description, and I made the mistake once of not understanding that. I don't intend to make it again. She paused. I'm thinking about a director of systems integration role. It doesn't exist yet. I'd be creating it. It would give you actual authority over the technical systems you've been managing informally for years, reporting directly to me. Compensation that reflects what you actually contribute, not what a maintenance technician title says you should earn. Ethan looked at the table for a moment. What's the catch? He said. She blinked. There's no catch. There's always a catch with titles, he said. The catch is usually that the title comes with administrative weight that pulls you away from the actual work. She considered this honestly. There would be some administrative responsibility. Team oversight, project interface with the engineering leadership, some representation in client and federal program reviews. She paused. But the core of the role is what you already do. Understanding how these systems actually behave versus how the documentation says they should behave, and having the authority to act on that understanding without going through 3 layers of approval. He thought about that. About the years of raising concerns through proper channels and watching them get managed. About flagging a seal issue in an email at 6 in the morning and having it fall to page 2 of someone's inbox. I want 2 conditions, he said. Okay? First, any technical safety concern I raise gets treated as a mandatory stop and review, not a recommendation, not a flag for follow-up, a stop. He met her eyes. If I say something needs to be looked at before we proceed, we stop and look at it. She nodded without hesitation. Done. Second, I want a formal attribution protocol built into the company's project documentation process. Not for me specifically, for everyone. Engineers, technicians, support staff, whoever contributes a technical innovation, it gets documented at the point of contribution, not retroactively cleaned up, not absorbed into team records without individual credit. At the point of contribution. He paused. Because what happened to me? I wasn't the first, and without a structural change, I won't be the last. Olivia was quiet for a moment. That's a significant process change, she said. I know. It'll push back against some cultural habits that are pretty entrenched in this industry. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. You asked what I wanted. That's what I want. She looked at the table, then back at him. I'll do it, she said. It'll take time to implement properly, but I'll commit to it. She paused. And I'll want you involved in designing it because you understand where the gaps are better than anyone. He nodded. Then I'll take the role. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it. It was not a triumphant moment exactly. It didn't feel the way he might have expected it to feel, back when he was 23 and first beginning to understand that the record wasn't reflecting what he was actually doing. It felt less like winning and more like a correction, like a calculation being brought back into alignment with the underlying reality. He drove home that evening with the particular emptiness of a person who has been running on high alert for 10 days and whose nervous system is beginning to understand that the acute phase is over. Not the tiredness of failure, the tiredness of sustained effort that has arrived somewhere worth arriving. He picked up Lily from Janet's. She was in Janet's living room with a book, which was her default state in most environments that offered a comfortable chair and enough light. She looked up when he came in. You look different, she said. Different how? She considered this with the seriousness she applied to most assessments. Less like you're waiting for something. Janet, in the kitchen, made a sound that might have been agreement. Come on, he said. Let's go home. In the car, Lily buckled herself in with the particular focused efficiency of a child who has strong opinions about doing things herself, and then looked at him as he pulled out of Janet's driveway. So what happened? She said. I took a new job, he said, at the same company. She processed this. The one that fired you? Yes. Isn't that weird? He thought about it. A little, he said, but the work is there, and some things got fixed that needed fixing. Like what? Like the fact that for a long time the official record of who did what didn't match who actually did what. And now it's going to. Lily was quiet for a moment with the expression of someone processing a concept that touches something larger than its surface description. Like getting credit for your work, she said. Yes? Like on a group project when someone else puts their name on your part? Exactly like that, he said. Just for 11 years instead of one project. She turned to look out the window. That's really not okay, she said, with the flat moral clarity of someone for whom the ethics of the situation are simply obvious. No, he agreed. It's not. But it's fixed now. Getting there. She nodded, satisfied with that answer in a way that adults sometimes can't manage. The ability to accept getting there as a complete answer rather than an insufficient one. He had always appreciated that quality in her. They got home. He made dinner, the pasta situation again, because Thursday night was pasta night even when it was Monday, and the whole week had been inverted. And they ate at the kitchen table, and Lily told him about a book she'd finished at Janet's and described the ending in enough detail that he understood the full emotional arc of the thing, which was her way of processing stories she'd found meaningful. And he listened the way he always listened, which was, actually. After dinner, she did her homework, and he looked over it and she went to bed, and afterward he sat at the kitchen table with the cold tea situation and looked at the refrigerator and the drawing and the mug rack. He thought about Richard Hale, who was probably in his house tonight working through what came next. He wasn't glad about it in the way the word glad usually implies. There was nothing satisfying about imagining Richard's evening. What had happened to Richard was a consequence, and consequences are neither satisfying nor unsatisfying in themselves. They're just accurate. He had built something dishonest, and the dishonesty had been found, and that was the correct outcome, and also, simply, the outcome. He didn't spend much time on it. He thought about the attribution protocol he'd asked for, about designing something that would catch, going forward, what the previous system had failed to catch. It was the kind of problem he was good at, structural, systemic, with clear failure modes and addressable gaps. He'd already started thinking through what it would need to contain, the way he started thinking through any engineering problem. Identify the failure mode, identify where in the process it occurs, design the intervention at that point rather than downstream. He got up and found a notepad, the paper kind, not his laptop, and wrote for 20 minutes. Not a formal proposal, just the thinking. He filled 3 pages with a combination of words and diagrams and arrows, the visual shorthand that was his natural language for problems he was working through, and when he ran out of things to say for the evening, he folded the pages in half and set them on the counter. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in the particular rhythm of transition. The week after a crisis has resolved when the work is still urgent, but the edge has come off, when systems are stabilizing and the focus shifts from emergency management back to the ordinary forward motion of a project. Ethan spent both days in Bay 7 and in the engineering team's workroom, doing something he'd rarely been invited to do before, which was sit in on the technical planning sessions with Kowalski's team as a participant rather than as someone who was occasionally consulted through a door. The difference was not small. In the planning sessions, problems got aired early, before they became crises. Options got evaluated by people with different kinds of knowledge. The session on Tuesday morning produced a revision to the testing protocol for the next phase of the project that Ethan thought was more realistic than the previous plan, and it came out of a 40-minute conversation between him, Chen, and 2 engineers he hadn't worked with closely before. Chen had changed in the past week. Not dramatically. He was still careful, still slightly formal, still the kind of engineer who triple-checked his inputs before committing to an answer. But there was a different quality to how he engaged with Ethan, less defensive, more willing to think out loud. On Wednesday afternoon, Chen stopped him in the workroom. "I looked up your name," he said. Ethan looked at him. "My name on what?" Chen was slightly awkward about this in a way that was genuine rather than performed. "The patent corrections, the ones being filed." He paused. "I looked at the technical specifications, in the guidance architecture patent." He stopped again. "I've been working on this project for 2 years. I thought I understood the architecture." "You do understand it. I understood the version that was in the documentation. The specification in the original, your specification, has 3 layers that aren't in the documented version, things that got simplified out when it got formalized. He looked at him directly. Did you know those layers were removed? Ethan thought about it. I knew the formalized version was simplified, he said. I thought the simplification was a reasonable translation for documentation purposes. It wasn't. Chen was quiet for a moment. It's why we had the calibration drift issue. The monitoring architecture in the implemented system doesn't account for the thermal gradient interaction that your original specification had built in. It was designed out when the specification was when it was taken over. The room was quiet. So the 7-week calibration drift, Ethan said slowly, is directly traceable to the simplification of your original architecture. Chen met his eyes. The system was built from a version of your design that was missing a critical component, and nobody knew that component was missing because nobody knew whose design it originally was. Ethan sat with that for a moment. It was one thing to know that 11 years of work had been taken. It was another to trace, in a specific and concrete chain of causation, how the taking of that work had led to the exact crisis that had brought him back. The system had failed because it had been built from a version of his design that had been stripped of its most important structural element, and it had been stripped because the person who'd taken ownership of the design had understood enough to adopt it, but not enough to understand why every piece of it was there. I want to document that, Ethan said. I already started, Chen said. I wanted to check with you first. He paused. I should have paid more attention to attribution earlier. I didn't ask where things came from. I should have. It was, as apologies go, an honest one. Not theatrical, not overloaded with feeling, just a direct acknowledgement from a person who had thought about something and arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. You're paying attention now, Ethan said. Chen nodded. They went back to work. Thursday brought the first formal step in the internal record correction. A company-wide communication from Olivia Sterling's office informing Meridian employees that a documentation review had identified attribution errors in project records spanning 11 years and that the company was undertaking a formal correction process. It named Ethan Brooks specifically. It named the role he had actually played. It did not name Richard Hale because HR and legal had advised against it pending the resolution of ongoing processes, but the context was not obscure to anyone who had been paying attention. Ethan was in Bay 7 when the communication went out. He knew it was coming. Olivia had told him the day before and shown him the draft. He had asked her to add a line that the attribution correction process had been designed to function going forward as a permanent structural change, not a one-time cleanup. She had added it. He read it on his phone, standing near the monitoring station. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and went back to the check he'd been running. Marcus came over 15 minutes later. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood next to Ethan and looked at the assembly. How do you feel? He said, finally. Ethan thought about it. Like something that was out of alignment got put back, he said. Not fixed, not made right in some big final way, just corrected. That's not nothing, Marcus said. No, Ethan agreed. It's not nothing. Marcus was quiet for another beat. You know what the crew is saying? I can guess. They're saying it's about time. Marcus's voice was level but warm. That's the whole of it. No drama, just, it's about time. Ethan looked at the assembly. 14 months of 30 people's work. A guidance system that was going to work correctly because someone had understood all the way down why each piece of it was there. Tell them I said thanks, he said. You can tell them yourself. They're all right there? Ethan turned. The assembly crew, a dozen of them visible from where he stood, had found reasons to be in Bay 7 or adjacent to it in the past 20 minutes. Not gathered, exactly. Not performing anything. Just present. Marcus, who had engineered this in the same low-key way he engineered most things, looked entirely innocent. Ethan walked over. He was not a speech-making person. He didn't have a natural register for the kind of acknowledgement moment that would have felt, in a different story, like the obvious culmination. He shook hands, said, thanks for the work, and the project's in good shape, and a few specific things to specific people. The assembly team lead about a connector issue he'd been watching, Chen about the architecture documentation they'd be working on, It was less than a minute with each person, and it was entirely real, and that was enough. He was back at panel 7C 20 minutes later, running a check. The assembly hummed quietly around him. At 5:30, he closed up his station and collected his tools with the methodical care of 9 years of habit. He stopped by the monitoring station for a final readout check. Clean, consistent, everything where it should be. And then he drove to pick up Lily. She was in the after-school program drawing something, which was her default state in most environments that offered paper. She gathered her things with the speed of someone who has been waiting for this moment and would prefer not to delay it. In the car, she was quiet for a couple of minutes. Then, "Dad." "Yeah." "Priya's mom told my teacher that your name was going to be on the patents." He glanced at her. "How does Priya's mom know about that?" "Her mom reads the news." He looked back at the road. The local industry press had picked up the documentation correction story that morning. Someone had written a brief piece on it, probably based on the company communication. He hadn't expected it to spread that fast. "It's complicated," he said. "The patent correction takes time." "But eventually?" "Eventually, yes." She thought about this. "Will your name be bigger than the other person's name or the same size?" He almost laughed. "Same size. Names on patents are just names." She seemed slightly disappointed by this, as if she'd been picturing a hierarchy of font sizes that reflected moral outcomes. "Still," she said, "it'll be there. It'll be there." She looked out the window. Mom would have liked that. The wire of grief, thin and precise. There and gone. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." They drove the rest of the way home in easy quiet, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Friday morning, 9 days after Ethan had first walked back into Bay 7 with his travel mug and his daughter's handprint in orange paint and the specific stillness of someone who has decided what they're here to do, the post-simulation monitoring completed its final cycle. Ethan ran the closing diagnostic at 7:45, every parameter nominal. The calibration holding, the connectors holding, the seal doing what C-Series seals were designed to do. He documented the completion, signed it, gave it to Kowalski. Kowalski read it with the care he'd developed in the past week and a half for reading documents that Ethan gave him. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," Ethan said. Kowalski looked at him. "The whole system is where it needs to be." "The whole system is where it needs to be," Ethan confirmed. They stood in Bay 7 for a moment, the two of them, with the machines and the hum and the morning light coming in through the high windows on the east wall. 9 days, Kowalski said. 9 days. Kowalski nodded. He had the expression of a man recalibrating something internal, reassessing an assumption he'd held for long enough that he hadn't known it was an assumption. "I'm going to read my emails differently," he said. "Good," Ethan said. He picked up his coffee, the orange handprint mug, battered and permanent, and his. Outside Bay 7, the facility was coming alive with the ordinary sounds of a morning that would, from the outside, look like any other morning. People arriving, coffee being made, monitors coming on, the low institutional hum of a large operation resuming its forward motion. Inside, the assembly sat clean and calibrated and ready for the next phase of a project that was going to work, because the right person had understood, all the way down to its foundations, why every single piece of it was the way it was. Ethan drank his coffee. The lights hummed their slightly uneven frequency. He noticed. He always would. The weeks after a crisis resolves don't announce themselves. There's no clear line between the emergency and the aftermath. It's more like a tide going out, gradual and uneven, leaving behind a changed landscape that you have to learn to navigate differently than the one before. Ethan noticed it first in small things, the way he slept through the night again without his mind pulling him awake at 3 a.m. to run through system states. The way his shoulders had stopped carrying the particular tension that 9 years of invisible weight produces in a person who has been holding more than his official job description allowed him to acknowledge. The way Bay 7 felt less like contested territory and more like simply a place he worked. He was a week into the Director of Systems Integration role, officially, with a title on the org chart and a salary that didn't require him to do arithmetic about whether the mortgage was going to be fine. When the Patent Office formally acknowledged receipt of Meridian's correction request, and opened the review process. Sandra Voss's firm had prepared the submission package, which ran to over 200 pages of supporting documentation. The Patent Office assigned a review examiner and set a preliminary response timeline of 4 to 6 months. 4 to 6 months was a long time. Ethan had accepted this when the General Counsel had explained it, and he accepted it now. Patent law moved at its own pace, indifferent to the human timeline underneath it. He had waited 11 years for the record to start correcting itself. 4 to 6 months was not, in that context, an unreasonable further patience. What he hadn't expected was how it felt to have the process in motion at all. Not euphoric. He wasn't built for euphoria, and the situation didn't call for it. But there was something in knowing that the formal machinery of institutional record was now moving in the direction of truth rather than away from it, that felt like a pressure he hadn't consciously identified releasing. He mentioned this to Marcus on a Tuesday morning while they were running a routine check on the assembly 3 weeks after the simulation had passed. "I didn't know I was still carrying it," he said, which was not his usual mode of conversation, but which the context seemed to call for. Marcus glanced at him. "Carrying what specifically?" "The weight of knowing the record was wrong and not being able to do anything about it." He adjusted a calibration point. "I'd adapted to it, made a kind of peace with it, but the peace was load-bearing. It was taking up space that turns out I can use for other things." Marcus considered this. "What other things?" Ethan thought about it. "I don't know yet. That's kind of the point." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's either wise or concerning," he said. "I can't tell which." "Me neither," Ethan said. They went back to work. Richard Hale had retained a lawyer within 48 hours of his termination for cause, which Sandra Voss had predicted and which Olivia's legal team had prepared for. The lawyer's initial posture was what legal teams call aggressive management, pushing on procedural questions about the investigation scope and the documentary evidence and the process by which the termination decision had been made. It was less about the substance of what the investigation had found and more about looking for technical angles that might complicate the picture. Olivia's legal team was not particularly concerned. The documentary record was what it was. 87 pages of independently verified evidence had a weight that procedural arguments struggled to move. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic, which is how most corporate legal processes resolve. Not with a confrontation or a verdict, but with a settlement that acknowledges nothing formally while resulting in a specific agreed outcome. The specifics were confidential, as these things are. What Ethan knew, because Olivia told him directly, was that the settlement included Richard Hale's agreement not to contest the patent correction process, and his agreement to a statement of non-disclosure that effectively prevented him from publicly characterizing the investigation or its findings in ways inconsistent with the documentary record. He would not be going to prison. He would not face a public censure. He would face consequences that were real, financial, professional, reputational within the industry, but that were bounded and largely invisible to anyone not directly involved. Ethan had thought about this when Olivia told him. He'd thought about it for a day and arrived at the same place he usually arrived when he thought about Richard, which was somewhere past the heat of it and into something more functional. "Is that enough?" Olivia asked him during the meeting where she'd explained the settlement. She asked it carefully, not as a justification, but as a genuine question. "Probably not," he said. "In a fair accounting, probably not." He paused. "But the record is being corrected. The patents are in process. The internal documentation has my name on it now." He looked at her. "The structural change, the attribution protocol, is being built. That affects people going forward who I'll never meet." He set down the coffee he'd been holding. "I'm not going to tell you it's enough, because it isn't. But it moves the reality in the direction of accuracy, and that's what I was after." Olivia looked at him for a moment with the particular expression she had developed over the past weeks, which was something between respect and the slightly unsettling sensation of being in the presence of someone whose values don't bend under pressure the way most people's do. "Most people in your position would want more," she said. "Most people in my position haven't thought about it as carefully," he said. It wasn't arrogance. It was just the honesty of someone who has spent a long time with something and knows its actual shape. The attribution protocol took 6 weeks to design properly. Ethan led the process, which involved working sessions with HR, the engineering team, the documentation department, and two external consultants Olivia had brought in who specialized in organizational IP management. It was not a glamorous process. It involved a lot of conversations about edge cases and implementation logistics, and the specific human habits that cause attribution systems to fail in practice. Which is to say, it involved Ethan knowing exactly where the gaps were because he had lived inside those gaps for a decade. The final protocol established three things that hadn't existed before. First, a contribution log, a running record attached to every active project, accessible to all contributors, where technical innovations were documented at the point they occurred rather than being absorbed into team records retroactively. Second, a verification step in the documentation workflow that required originating contributions to be attributed before the document could be finalized. A structural speed bump that made accidental omission unlikely and deliberate omission visible. Third, a semi-annual attribution audit conducted by someone outside the immediate project team to catch drift and correct it before it became entrenched. None of it was foolproof. Ethan had been explicit about that in every design session. The protocol would slow down certain documentation processes. It would occasionally create friction when people disagreed about who had originated a specific idea. It would require sustained management attention to maintain over time, and attention is a resource that gets diverted by other priorities, and any system that depends on sustained attention will eventually face a moment when the attention wavers. Then what? One of the HR team members had asked in the fifth working session. If we know it's going to face that moment, what's the safeguard? You build the accountability into the audit, Ethan said, and you make sure the audit findings go directly to the senior leadership level, not to a middle management layer that can absorb and manage them. He paused. The reason things at this company stayed invisible for 11 years is that the person managing the information was also the person the information was about. The audit has to report to someone who doesn't have skin in the game. Olivia, who was in that session, made a note. The protocol went live the second Monday of the following month. Ethan wrote the implementation memo himself, which was the first official company communication that bore his name as author. It was a 2-page document, plain and direct, explaining what was changing and why. It did not recount his personal history. It did not position itself as a correction of past wrongs, because that framing, while accurate, would have made it about him specifically rather than about the structural reality it was trying to address. The last line read, "The purpose of this protocol is to ensure that the people who build things at this company are recognized as the people who built them." That's not a complicated principle. It just requires that we build it into the process rather than leaving it to goodwill and memory, which have historically been insufficient. Chen forwarded it to him later that day with a single line of response. This is the right thing. Ethan had thought about that for a moment before replying. He typed yes and then deleted it, and typed should have been standard practice for a long time, and then deleted that too and just wrote thanks and sent it, because Chen knew what he meant and the elaboration wasn't necessary. It was around this time, the 6th week after the immediate crisis had resolved, about a month and a half into the new role, that the work itself began to shift in a way Ethan found harder to articulate than the technical changes. He'd spent 9 years being someone whose knowledge was used without being named, whose presence in the building was institutional and real and officially invisible. The new role changed the texture of his days in ways that went beyond the title and the salary and the seat in the planning meetings. People came to him now with problems before they became problems. Not because a crisis had demonstrated his value, though that had happened, but because the organizational structure now created a path, a formal, intended path, for his knowledge to be applied at the point where it was most useful. Early, when the problem was still small enough to be instructive rather than destructive. This was, as it turned out, the thing he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. Not recognition, exactly, though recognition mattered. Not compensation, though that mattered too. The thing he'd wanted, underneath the specific wrongs that had been done, was simply to be used correctly. To have the thing he was good at, the rare specific knowledge he'd spent years building, applied at the right moment and in the right way, and with the authority to act on it. He had not realized, until now, how much energy he'd been spending compensating for the absence of that alignment. He was in the engineering workroom on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks in, walking through a thermal interaction question with Chen and a newer engineer named Diaz, who had been with the project for 8 months and who had a habit of asking the second-level question, not just what is happening, but why is it happening, that Ethan found genuinely useful. They were working through a modeling problem that had come up in the next phase planning when Olivia appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, not interrupting. He noticed her from the corner of his eye, but continued the thread of the conversation because the thread was important, and Olivia was, by now, someone who understood that. When they reached a natural stopping point, he looked up. "Sorry," she said. "I can come back." "It's fine. What do you need?" She had a tablet with her. She held it up. There was an article on the screen from an industry publication. He could see his name in the headline from across the room. "It ran this morning," she said. "I wanted you to see it before you heard about it from someone else." He crossed the room and took the tablet. The article was about Meridian's documentation correction and the attribution protocol. Someone in the industry press had followed the story from the initial company communication and done actual reporting, called people, reviewed public documents, built a real piece. The headline was something about systemic attribution problems in aerospace manufacturing and what Meridian's response suggested for the industry. His name was in it. His contributions were described accurately. The protocol he designed was described as a potential model for the sector. It was not a flattering piece in the sense of being promotional. It was a substantive one, which was better. He read it through, handed the tablet back. "You knew this was coming?" he asked. "I spoke to the journalist last week. I told her the basic facts were on the record and she could use them." She paused. "I should have told you. I didn't because I wasn't sure the piece would be what it turned out to be, and I didn't want to raise your expectations for something that might have been a paragraph." She looked at him directly. "That was probably the wrong call. I'm telling you now." He looked at the tablet in her hand. The article. His name in a headline attached to work that was actually his. "Okay," he said. "Are you bothered by it?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I'm not." She nodded. There was something in her face. Not relief exactly, but a version of it that had more weight. "There are going to be follow-up inquiries," she said. "Other companies reaching out about the protocol, potentially a speaking request or two. I want to be clear that none of that is an obligation. You can engage with as much or as little of it as you want." "I'll think about it," he said. She turned to go, then stopped. "One more thing." She said it with a slight shift in register, less formal. "I've been meaning to ask you something for a few weeks, and I keep not finding the right moment, so I'm just going to ask it." He waited. "Do you trust this company?" she said. "Not me specifically. The company. The structure." She looked at him carefully. "Because I want you here, and I want the attribution protocol to matter, and I want the work you're doing to mean something that holds past the current moment. But I'm also aware that you stayed at this company for 9 years while something systematically wrong was happening to you, and I don't know what it costs a person to rebuild trust in an institution that failed them that significantly." It was, he thought, the most honest question she'd asked him, maybe because it was the one that required something from her to ask it, the acknowledgement that her reassurances alone were not sufficient, that the trust had to be earned rather than declared. He thought about it for a real moment, not a performative pause. He actually considered the question. "I trust the structure we've built," he said. "The protocol, the reporting lines, the audit process. I trust those because I built them, and I know where the gaps are, and I believe they're real." He paused. "I trust you enough to be here. That's not the same as full institutional trust, and I don't think I can give you full institutional trust on a 6-week timeline, and you probably shouldn't want me to, because institutional trust that comes back too fast after something like this isn't real trust. It's just relief." She was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "But I'm here," he said, "and I intend to stay." She nodded once, and that was enough, and she left. He turned back to Chen and Diaz, who had both been very professionally occupied with their laptops during that exchange. "Where were we?" he said. "Thermal interaction at junction 7C under variable load," Chen said immediately. "Right." He pulled up his diagram. "So the thing that the current model is missing He worked until 6. The thing about the work, the actual physical work, the systems and the machines and the honest feedback of metal and calibration and load distribution, was that it remained what it had always been regardless of everything else. The title didn't change what a B-series seal did under extended thermal load. The salary didn't change the physics of a stress fracture at a junction point. The industry article didn't change the specific way the monitoring array responded to a 2-degree ambient temperature drop when an exterior door opened. The work was the work. That was, Ethan understood, the part of it he trusted most completely. Not because it was untouched by human failure, but because its failures were honest. When a system told you something was wrong, it wasn't managing you. It wasn't protecting its position. It was simply reporting the state of reality, and if you listened carefully enough, it would tell you exactly what you needed to know. He had always found that quality in machines more reliable than the equivalent quality in institutions. Institutions could maintain the appearance of function long after the underlying reality had failed. Machines couldn't do that for long. They reported their own breakdown sooner or later in the only language they had. He thought about this on the drive home that Thursday evening, about the long, specific chain of events that had started with a B-series seal in a secondary housing and ended with his name in a headline and a protocol that would change how this company documented its own work going forward. The chain was not elegant. It was not the kind of story where the pieces fit together with narrative precision, where the injustice was dramatic and the resolution was proportional, and the people involved were clearly heroes and villains. It was messier than that. Richard Hale had not been a cartoonish villain. He had been a specific kind of person who made a specific kind of choice early in his career and then spent 16 years making smaller choices that preserved the initial one. Olivia Sterling had not been a corrupt owner. She had been a competent person who had trusted the wrong intermediary at the wrong moment. Kowalski had not been negligent. He had been busy, which is different, and the difference matters even if the outcome was the same. Even Ethan himself had not been a flawless protagonist. He had made a calculation in 2020 that he still didn't feel fully settled about, a choice that was understandable and still cost something he would rather have not paid. People were imperfect. Institutions amplified certain imperfections while suppressing others, depending on what the institution rewarded and what it made invisible. Change happened not because someone was good enough or strong enough to force it, but because the accumulation of evidence eventually made the current state harder to maintain than the corrected state. He had flagged a seal issue on his way out the door on a Tuesday morning, and that small specific act had been the thing that made the accumulated evidence visible. Not heroism, not strategy, just the habit of a person who notices when something is wrong and says so, regardless of whether it's convenient. He pulled into his driveway. Lily was in the front yard with a piece of chalk, working on something large and ambitious on the driveway pavement. She looked up when his car pulled in, assessed him with her standard 7, almost 8-year-old efficiency, and returned to her chalk work. He got out of the car and walked over. She was drawing a map, a detailed one, with roads and buildings and what appeared to be a bay or harbor on the left side. She'd labeled several of the buildings in her careful block printing. "What is this?" he asked. "The city where our story happens," she said. He looked at her. "Our story?" "Priya and I are writing a story." She added a road. "It's about an engineer who knows how everything works, and nobody believes her until something breaks." He stood in the driveway for a moment. "Her?" he said. "Obviously," Lily said, with the breezy confidence of someone for whom this required no elaboration. He crouched down next to the map, looked at the detailed buildings, the labeled streets, the harbor. His daughter, chalk-dusted and matter-of-fact, adding a bridge between two sections of her city. "Is she okay at the end?" he asked. Lily looked at him. "Yes," she said, "but it takes a while, and she has to do most of it herself." She added a final detail to the bridge. "That's what makes it good." He looked at the map for another moment. Then he sat down on the driveway next to her, which was undignified and also the correct thing to do, and she handed him a piece of chalk without being asked, and they worked on the city together for 30 minutes in the late afternoon light until Janet called from her porch that she'd made extra soup and were they eating or not, and Lily said yes immediately and on behalf of both of them, and they went inside. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning that had the particular quality of late autumn, cool and clear and slightly too quiet, the kind of morning that makes the interior of a warm kitchen feel specifically good. Ethan made pancakes. This was not an unusual event. Saturday morning pancakes were what they were. But this Saturday was different in a way that he'd been aware of since he woke up, the way you're sometimes aware of significant dates before you've consciously registered them. The patent office had issued its preliminary determination the previous Wednesday. They'd reviewed the supporting documentation from Sandra Voss's firm and the submission package from Meridian's legal team and the additional technical declarations that Chen had filed and that Ethan had reviewed line by line before they went in. The preliminary determination found in favor of the correction request on both patents. The process was not finished. There was a comment period, a potential response period, the final formal issuance. But the preliminary determination was the substantive moment. The rest was procedural. His name was going to be on those patents, not instead of others. The engineering team's contributions were real, and the attribution would reflect that. But alongside them, where it had always belonged, restored from the absence that 11 years of careful management had created. He stood at the stove and thought about Claire. He did this less often than he used to, not because he thought about her less, but because the thinking had changed its character. In the first 2 years after she died, thinking about her was almost always tinged with the specific pain of absence, the immediate wrong of her not being present. Now, 6 years on, it was more like returning to a place you know well. Still had weight, just a different kind. She would have been sitting at this kitchen table right now. She would have had strong opinions about the pancakes. She thought he put too much vanilla in. And she would have had something precise and useful to say about everything that had happened in the past 4 months. She would have been proud in the unsentimental way she was proud of things, which was to say, she would not have made a production of it, but you would have known. He flipped the pancakes. Lily appeared from the hallway in her pajamas, hair slightly unresolved, carrying the book she'd been reading the night before with one finger still marking her place, because she had the reading habit of someone who does not accept the interruption of meals as sufficient reason to entirely lose her place. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the stove. "Chocolate chips?" she asked. "There are none." "We're out?" "We were out last week. I said I'd get more." "You didn't get more." "I know." He put a plate in front of her. "Plain pancakes." She looked at the plate with the philosophical resignation of someone who has been here before and knows that objecting doesn't change the pancake situation. "The patent office thing," she said, and then was quiet in a way that suggested she was deciding how to continue. He sat down across from her with his own plate. "Yeah." Priya's mom explained what a patent is. She poured syrup with the careful focus of someone who has been told not to use too much and is trying to honor this in spirit while also getting an adequate amount. She said your name being on it means it's official, like officially official, not just the company's records, but actually official forever. That's a reasonable description. Lily looked at her pancakes. "When I was little," she started, and then seemed to recalibrate, aware that at almost 8, she was in the process of deciding what age counts as little. "When I was really little, like 5, I asked you why you didn't have your name on the big projects at work, and you said sometimes that's just how it works." He remembered that conversation. He'd been giving her a bath and she'd asked out of nowhere, the way children ask things out of nowhere when the question has been assembling itself for a while. "I said that," he confirmed. "Was that true?" He thought about it. "It was true that it's how it had worked," he said. "It wasn't true that it's how it should work, or that it was okay that it worked that way." He paused. "I think I was trying to explain something complicated in a way that wouldn't upset you." She considered this seriously. "I would have rather you been upset about it," she said. "It's okay to be upset about unfair things." The thin wire of grief, but differently angled this time. Not about Claire. About the version of himself who had made that calculation for his 5-year-old the way he'd made all the other calculations. Practically, with the protective instinct of a parent who wants their child to believe the world is navigable. "You're right," he said. "I should have said it was unfair." She nodded with the satisfaction of a point established. Then she cut into her pancake. "Is it fixed now?" she said. "Most of it. The parts that can be fixed legally are in process. The parts inside the company are done. He drank his coffee. Some parts don't get fixed. The years, the specific projects where the record's too old or too diffuse to correct individually. He set down the mug. But the direction changed. That's what matters most. That the direction changed. She seemed to think about that for a moment. Like when you fix a calibration drift, she said, you can't undo the drift that already happened, but you fix it going forward. He looked at her. That's exactly right, he said. She returned to her pancakes with the air of someone who has made a good point, knows it, and is now graciously moving on. Outside, the Saturday morning was doing what Saturday mornings do. Quiet. Ordinary. The neighbor's cat crossing the yard. A car starting somewhere down the block. The specific light of late autumn, low and clean through the kitchen window, laying a rectangle of warmth across the table. Lily finished half her pancakes and declared herself done, which he had anticipated. She pushed the plate toward the center of the table and opened her book to the marked page. He had also anticipated this. He sat with his coffee and the remains of his own plate and thought about the shape of the past 4 months. Not with nostalgia. He was too close to it for nostalgia. And anyway, nostalgia required a rose-tinted quality that the actual experience hadn't possessed. It had been hard work, uneven and imperfect, and conducted under the specific pressure of a crisis that had real stakes for real people. The resolution was real, but partial. The record was being corrected, but the correction was slow and bounded by processes he didn't control. The trust he'd told Olivia he had for the structure they'd built was genuine and also provisional, because provisional was what honesty required. And yet, he had sat in this kitchen 2 months ago on a Tuesday night with a cold cup of tea and a cardboard box on the passenger seat of his car. He had driven to a diner and ordered pancakes with his daughter and told her that a woman had made a decision based on wrong information and that a person had given her the wrong information on purpose. And Lily had said that's not fair with the flat clarity of someone for whom the ethics required no analysis. And now the record was being corrected. And the protocol was live. And the work, the actual work, the systems and the machines and the 14 months of 30 people building something that would work because someone had understood it all the way down. That work had passed every test. He had not fixed the unfairness of the past 11 years. He had not made Richard Hale's choices not have happened. He had not recovered the specific years or the specific moments of recognition that he had deserved and not received. Claire watching him get the commendation he'd earned, Lily being able to say at school that her dad's name was on the thing he'd invented. Those things were gone. They had the specific irrecoverability of past time. What he had done was change the direction. Make the next version of the thing. Whatever person was sitting in whatever bay at whatever company in 10 years, doing work that no one official was paying attention to, slightly more likely to be visible. Slightly more likely to have their name attached to the thing they built. That mattered. Not as consolation for what had been lost, as its own separate thing worth doing regardless of the personal cost. He picked up his coffee. Lily turned a page. He thought about the note from the industry publication that had arrived last week, an invitation to speak at a symposium on engineering attribution practices, alongside 2 academics and a senior engineer from a competitor firm. He had not decided yet. He was not a natural public person, and the thought of a symposium had a particular kind of exhaustion attached to it that he associated with being watched rather than working. But Chen had said, when he'd mentioned it, that the protocol would matter more if someone who had actually lived inside the failure of its absence was the one explaining why it was necessary. Ethan had written Chen's point in his notepad that night and not said anything else about it, which was how he signaled that something had landed. He would probably go, not because it was comfortable, but because the discomfort was not the right reason to refuse it. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter who was almost 8 and who drew maps of fictional cities on driveways and had precise moral clarity about unfair things. He had a job that used what he actually knew and gave him the authority to act on it. He had a formal record that was in the process of being corrected, slowly and imperfectly, but actually. He had a protocol with his fingerprints all over it that would change how this company, and possibly others, managed the gap between what people built and what the official record said they built. He did not have Claire. He would always not have Claire. And the ache of that was woven into everything else, not gone, but integrated. The way certain structural elements get incorporated into a system rather than corrected out of it. He did not have the 11 years back. He had what came after. He had enough. Lily looked up from her book. She had the expression she got when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. Dad? Yeah. When I'm old enough to have a job, she said carefully, and I build something, I want to make sure my name is on it. He looked at her. It will be, he said. She looked at him steadily, the way she had looked at him since she was old enough to look at anything, directly and without performance, with the specific quality of attention she'd inherited from someone who was no longer here to know she'd inherited it. I know, she said, because you'll make sure. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up her plate and his and carried them to the sink and turned on the water and listened to the ordinary Saturday morning sounds of the house settling around them. The pipes, the faint wind against the window, the distant sound of a neighbor's lawn equipment starting up, and washed the dishes with the unhurried attention he brought to most things that mattered. Behind him, Lily turned another page. The rectangle of winter light moved slowly across the table as the morning advanced. Outside, the city went about its business, indifferent and alive, full of people building things that needed to be built, in the ordinary, unwitnessed way that most of the world's real work gets done. The machines in Bay 7 ran clean, the record was being corrected. The direction had changed, and in a kitchen on a Saturday morning, a man washed dishes while his daughter read, and the light moved across the table, and the world held its imperfect shape, and it was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.